Welcome, everyone. Today I'm going to be doing another one of my counter-apologetics videos, and in particular, I have selected this one from Capturing Christianity from Cameron, where he seems to have focused once again on the video that he did, I don't know, a few months ago now, on 100 plus arguments for the existence of God with Chad, what was his name? Chad McIntosh, yes, which I reviewed with Nathan from Digital Gnosis. So you can check out those videos. I'll put a link in the description. Welcome, Carl, first here. And so I saw that Cameron released this video when was it? A little while ago now, a bit over a week. I haven't watched it yet, but I've been meaning to have a look at it. And so I figured, well, why not provide some commentary on it? So I haven't actually seen this video, haven't watched any of it. So we'll be moving through it together. I've heard some things about it, so I'm expecting some interesting things to chat about. And I guess the sort of meta point to be made here is, what is the place of the arguments in thinking about God and Christianity and philosophical questions? And when I say arguments, I mean the sort of deductive syllogisms that Cameron presented in the original 100 plus arguments video. And I've argued, and sort of Graham Oppy and others have argued, that these sorts of syllogistic arguments don't really help very much. At most, they're sort of a summary of a set of ideas that might be useful for getting the main point across, or for analyzing. But in themselves, they just really summarize things that people in a given belief system will already believe, and people outside that belief system probably won't. And so they'll just reject one or more of the premises. And therefore, it's sort of unclear what discursive value or persuasive value they're supposed to have. And I think we'll sort of see that through the course of the video. Well done, Tom. Congratulations. Although I don't know what an A star is. Maybe that's an A plus or something that's used in philosophy that I'm not aware of. All right. So what was there? Was there something else I wanted to say about this? No, I don't think so. Let's just get started. Oh.
Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm welcoming you to the stream. We're talking about arguments for God's existence. I did a stream with a guy named Dr. Chad McIntosh. Let me go ahead and pull him up on the screen here, which we've had some technical issues with his internet. So hopefully his internet stays clean throughout the entirety of the show. We'll see how it goes. If worse comes to worse, it'll just be basically me and Ted for the show today. But let me just
All right, let's rate bookshelves. So I think Chad is, I like the right-hand side bookshelf because of the nice diversity of books. They're all stacked, vertical, none of them stacked, or placed vertical, none of them stacked on top of each other. There are some things that are not books on the bookshelf, which I don't like, so some marks taken off of that. And I don't like the left-hand side bookshelf here because these all appear to be like journal volumes or something, and it just looks boring. Like, you probably don't read those anyway, so marks taken off there. Maybe I'll give this a 6.5 out of 10. The angle is also a little bit, like, it's not quite centered, so it's, yeah, 6.5 out of 10 for that bookshelf. Cameron Bertuzzi's bookshelf, it really just looks like it's more for show than anything else. Like, there's actually not many books on there. It's mostly like, what is that? Is that his 100K YouTube placard thing? Maybe it's not. It looks a bit like that. And I know he just got over 100K subs. So maybe and then, there's just other stuff and like empty space. So it's a bit, plus it's not in focus, so I can't see it. Although it is good alignment, so I enjoy that. So maybe a 4 out of 10 overall. And as for Todd here, I like the bookshelf. I like the arrangement of books, different volumes, which is sort of visually interesting. Some of these seem to be library books based on the sticker here, which you lose points for because they're not actually yours. But there's a lot of open space here where we could have more books. So maybe I'll give this one a 5 out of 10. All right, having rated all of the bookshelves, let's continue.
Give you some background on where the stream is coming from, why it's important. So Dr. Chad McIntosh and I did a stream where we laid out, it was like a 4.5-hour marathon stream. It was ridiculously long. So we laid out, or really Chad did all of this work, but he laid out 150 something arguments for the existence of God that have showed up in the peer-reviewed literature over the centuries. So it was a whole lot of arguments. And at the end, we went through, like, what does all of this mean? Can you add up all of these arguments together probabilistically? Does that mean that it's more likely or not that God exists? How do all of these arguments sort of work together? So those are the types of questions that we were addressing at the end. Some atheists made response videos to that. But then also we know that Dr. Ted Poston, who's on
some atheists made response videos to that. So Nathan and I went through every single one of those 154 arguments in a response video that we did, which was like 8 hours long. I don't know if there are other atheist YouTubers who've done response videos. There may be, but I can't help but thinking is at least partly talking about that particular video. I would love to talk about these arguments with Cameron, and we invited him. Well, we issued an invitation, at least on the video, to do so. But I mean, he's not interested in taking us up on that. But I extend the invitation here. If Cameron would like to talk about any of these arguments, I'll talk about one of them. I'll talk about all 154 of them. We can do it on his channel, my channel, a different channel. I'd love to chat about them, but I doubt he's going to take me up on that. But anyway, I think he's in part referring to us there.
On with us. He's right beneath me. Yeah, he's actually been on the channel before. We did a Q&A about a week and a half ago with him, and it was awesome. I highly recommend going checking that out. But he is like the cumulative case guy. So he's been working on this for, I think in our interview, you said it was like basically since you were in grad school, you've been thinking about these kinds of issues, independence, how to, when you add up all of these different pieces of evidence, how does it all work? So you're the cumulative case guy. And so Chad and I just thought it was a great idea to get all of us together to talk about what do we do with all of these arguments? Do they actually matter? There's a lot of people in the comments, a lot of atheists were saying, you add up a whole bunch of zeros, then you're still going to wind up with zero. So no, we don't have any evidence. All of these arguments are weak, they're bad, they're terrible. So none of them add up to anything. You're not getting a higher probability that God exists just because you have a whole bunch of arguments. Then there's a question of what about atheist arguments? It's not, it's pretty well known that there's a problem of evil for theists. And so how does that factor in? So anyway, those are the types of questions that we're talking about today on the show. So, but we're limited on time today.
So I also did a parody of the 150 arguments, of 500 arguments against Christianity video with Nathan, which I'll put a link to as well. And obviously deliberately padding the number there to get to the 500, although there were about 130 distinct arguments and then like different versions of each one to bring it up to the 500. So you can check that out as well. I think that this idea of trying to get large numbers of arguments is just incredibly silly. And what we should be focusing on is core issues, of which there's maybe, I don't know, a dozen or something. I mean, depends how you count them, right? Like morality or creation or God's nature, things like that, right? We can talk about historicity of the New Testament. But just packaging up like heaps and heaps of arguments, I think is just so silly. And the thing that Cameron did at the end of his video, which he's mentioning, which is when they have the spreadsheet with all of the numbers in it and they put the number of arguments in and it calculates a Bayes factor, is incredibly dumb. But I think they're going to be going over that again here. So I'll talk more about that later. By the way, I really love the animation on the top right screen here where it's like it's Star Trek and you're moving through the stars. That's really cool. Production quality is always top
we're just going
notch.
to jump straight into the material. So I'm going to pass it over to Chad. And Chad, why don't you take it away because you've got an outline for us today. Oh, and let me, before I pass it over, one thing that I'll mention is that I've got the outline for today's stream actually linked in the description of this video. So if you just open it up, hit the little arrow down, you can click the link at the Google document and you can follow along the outline with us today. It's going to be a really, really fascinating show. I think you guys are going to get a lot out of it. So definitely stay tuned to the very, very end of this one. So, all right, Chad, where should we go from here?
Sure. Well, I think the best way to begin would be to get the basics of Bayes' theorem in place that will set up a good understanding of what a likelihood ratio is. So Ted is the expert here, so I think I should just hand it over to him for him to set us up.
Okay. Cool. Well, thanks, guys. So it's important to get sort of the big picture here. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get more clarity about how to assess the evidential power of a wide variety of considerations. And the cool thing is that Bayesianism and probability calculus provides a good tool for getting greater clarification about how you assess the cumulative case or the cumulative evidential power of a large body of evidence. So what we're going to do is I'll try to talk through this really, rather quickly and try to keep it intuitive. The first thing to note is probably just Bayes' theorem. So Bayes' theorem, it's a theorem of the probability calculus. And what it says is it tells you the probability of a hypothesis or a theory given a piece of evidence. And what's cool about Bayes' theorem is it's a mathematical equation that relates what's called the posterior probability to three other quantities. And what we can do is we can actually just focus on two of those quantities, which I'll explain in a bit. But it relates them. It says that the probability of a hypothesis given a piece of evidence is equal to how likely that hypothesis is in itself. So this is its prior probability, weighted, multiplied here, by the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis. So the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis just measures how likely it is that if the hypothesis were true, you would have that evidence. So for example, if you had a urn that had an equal number of black balls and white balls, you think, well, what's the probability that we select
not the bloody urn again
at random? And that probability would be 1/2, right? So this is called the likelihood. And underneath in the denominator of Bayes' theorem, you have the prior of the evidence. But what's kind of cool, what's actually really cool is that if you're comparing hypotheses, right, you can ignore the bottom factor. And what you can do is you can just compare what are known as the likelihood ratios. So this is the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis and over the probability of the evidence given another hypothesis. And that will tell you whether or not it's more likely that you have that evidence given the one hypothesis or the other. And the cool thing is you can just think about that not in terms of like plugging in actual numbers, but in terms of like the relative sizes or the relative magnitudes between the two quantities, right? So we could say you might not, be able to work out, numbers rather quickly in your head, but you could think, suppose we had an urn that had, 90 black balls and 10, white balls, and we had an urn that had 50 white balls and 50 black balls. Is the likelihood ratio going to favor, right, the urn with more black balls or the urn with fewer black balls? And you think, well, if we're asking about selecting a black ball, it's clearly going to favor the one with more black balls. And you can do this in general for theory. So you can say, all right, let's compare theism, for example, with naturalism. And does theism give more probability to us expecting a universe that is fine-tuned for life over naturalism? And it can be kind of difficult to come up with numbers here, but you can say, well, surely, right, given the nature.
It can be kind of difficult to come up with numbers here. So Bayes' theorem is, look, there's so many things one could say about Bayes' theorem. Look, it is used in some philosophical analysis. I don't really like its use in most applications. Outside of, say, probability, there's philosophy of probability itself, or like decision theories and such, where it has a role. But when we're actually applying it to assessing different worldviews, I mean, it's not. It seems mostly applied in the context of these sort of theism, atheism, or naturalism discussions, which itself is interesting. I haven't seen it used in other contexts. I mean, probably someone can find an example where it has been, like to evaluate different theories in ethics or in ontology or nominalism versus Platonism or something. Like, I've just never seen it used in those sorts of cases. But anyway, why? I think the reason is because the numbers that you plug in, Bayes' theorem just tells you how to combine numbers into a different number to tell you something interesting. But it's sort of a GIGO principle, garbage in, garbage out. If you put a bunch of numbers in that don't really mean much of anything, or you just plucked out of thin air, then the result is going to be equally meaningless. And that's really the problem, right? As he just said here, I can't remember this guy's name, sorry, Ted Poston. I'll probably just call him Ted. So as Ted said here, it can be difficult to come up with the numbers. Well, I would phrase it slightly differently. It's actually easy to come up with the numbers. It's just that you could invent whatever you like. How do you know what the likelihood is of, say, the appearance of fine-tuning under naturalism compared to the appearance of fine-tuning under theism? Anyone who claims to know that number is just making things up, because we don't know that number, especially under theism. But I would argue even under naturalism, we don't know what that number is. I discussed some of this in some of the videos I've done on fine-tuning, including my debate with Luke Barnes on this. But I mean, and that's just one argument. You apply that to other arguments as well, like moral argument or resurrection or whatever it is. We don't know these likelihoods here. We don't know how likely one hypothesis is given how likely the data is given a given hypothesis. We don't have any relevant probability distributions that we can base these estimates on. So it's all smoke and mirrors, in my opinion, when it's applied in this way. Again, it's not the theorem itself. It's just like, how do you get the relevant numbers? It's all well and good to say, here's a theorem that tells me how to update my beliefs on the basis of evidence. But if you don't know what numbers to put in, then the theory is basically useless. And that's my big issue with applying Bayes' theorem in these sorts of contexts. It just doesn't add anything, because we don't really know what we're putting into it. And I think that's why it is not widely used for this purpose in philosophical discourse. So anyway, let's see what they do with it here.
Nature of the theistic hypothesis, that it says, there is a being, of unlimited knowledge, power, and goodness. This being would want to bring about creatures of finite knowledge and power. These creatures would need to live in, some sort of community where they can get at each other, and this requires a stable world for the kinds of reasons that Swinburne and others give. And so you can say, well, look, that likelihood ratio favors theism over naturalism. And so what we can do with these big cumulative case arguments is that we can just compare the relevant likelihood ratio. And we can add those up under certain conditions, right? So we say one piece of evidence favors theism, another piece of evidence favors theism, another piece of evidence favors theism, then another piece of evidence favors naturalism strongly. Given a certain independence constraint, we can just add those up to get the cumulative force of all that evidence. So if you're interested in the details,
given an independence constraint. I love the way he just throws in, just assuming independence, like as if all of those pieces of evidence are independent of each other. I mean, okay, maybe some of the arguments are independent of each other, but we talked about this in Nathan and I when we did the response to the 150 arguments, and it's like of the 154 arguments, maybe, I can't remember what number I suggested, like being generous, maybe 20 of them could be said to be independent of each other, but more realistic, I think maybe like 4 of them are independent of each other. I mean, it depends how you define independence, and I think it's hard to define in this sort of philosophical context, because the thing is, all your beliefs are connected to each other, right? The position I take on substance dualism is going to have an impact on, say, the plausibility of the an immaterial God created the universe, or the plausibility of fine tuning, or the plausibility of some sort of moral argument, maybe, or an argument for the immateriality of the soul, or whatever else, right? Or whatever else it is. So there's going to be an interconnection of a lot of these ideas. So the notion that they're independent of each other is pretty absurd, and you can't just sort of wave that aside as an irrelevant detail. That's kind of central. So the two key problems with applying Bayes' theorem. Well, there's another one which is priors, but we'll leave that to the side for the moment. One is coming up with your likelihoods, which is your probabilities of the evidence given the hypothesis, and the other one is the problem of the relationship between them, essentially independence or lack of independence. Those are the two big problems, and he's just waving them aside. Like he mentioned both of them in like one brief sentence. But that's the big problem. Like, that's why you can't apply these, or at least it's extremely difficult. And you've got to be very careful about what assumptions you're making. Otherwise, it's just complete garbage what you're getting out of it. So I'd be very interested to see where they're going with this, because I'm not impressed with what I've heard so far.
Details here. I would encourage you to go check out this book. It's 24 or so arguments for God.
I've heard of this.
And at the end of that, I lay out the more details to the probability to Bayes' theorem and how you use this stuff. So just one other quick note.
So I probably have to read that book at some point.
And this is the condition
that
well, let's just think about it intuitively. Like if you have one witness to a crime, and that witness tells another witness about that crime, and then that witness tells a person about that crime, the second witness there, right, isn't independent, because they're just getting their information from the first witness. Compare that to a situation where you have two witnesses that both see the crime, right? One will report it and another will report it. In that case, their testimonies are independent, right? And so in general, we can think whether evidence is dependent or independent. And the cool thing about likelihood ratios is that if the evidence is independent, then you can just add them together.
Sorry, I thought he'd finished there, but I just let him finish out. That is a terrible explanation of the meaning of independence in the context of probability, or Bayesian likelihoods, because the notion of independent testimonies in terms of eyewitnesses means a different thing. I mean, it's somewhat related, but it's very different to the notion of statistical independence. Independent witnesses basically means they haven't colluded or talked to each other or exchanged details since witnessing the event. Ideally, although I would say that even that definition of independence is not what apologists typically mean, because they actually say, this just annoys me so much. They say, oh, we have independent witnesses, but then if you ask them who are your independent witnesses, it's like, oh, it's all of the disciples and the followers of Jesus who met with each other and talked to each other and exchanged stories with each other and developed a creed. Like those are not independent witnesses. But anyway, I'm getting distracted because that's another issue. But the point is, independent witnesses are witnesses who have not talked with each other since seeing the event. They're interviewed separately. They're not basing their accounts on each other. Independence, statistical independence, is totally different from that. Statistical independence means that two variables vary, well, independently of each other. Another way to say that would be that if I take the variance of one variable, I can't use that to predict the variation in the other variable. Now, the reason that's a difference between independent witnesses is if I take, it's a little unclear how you describe sort of a witness in terms of statistical terms, but imagine that you just take all of the claims that are made by the witness and you provide you numericize them in some way. And then, was he wearing a hat? Yes or no? Was he wearing a black t-shirt? Yes or no? Like something like that. And then you represent that as a series of data. And then I do that for my two different witnesses, right? If the witnesses were statistically independent, that would mean that I couldn't predict anything about one witness's testimony from the other witness's testimony. But real witnesses aren't going to be like that, are they? Because if they've witnessed the same event, then there's going to be a correlation. There's going to be a connection between what one witness says and what the other witness says, because they've seen the same thing. So if I have two variables that are totally independent from each other, then those aren't going to describe the testimony of two witnesses who have witnessed the same thing. They could describe two witnesses who've just made up their story, and so they don't vary the same. The point I'm making here is that statistical independence is totally different and not really analogous to testimonial independence. If I have independent pieces of evidence, they need to not co-vary with each other at all, which again is still somewhat vague because we haven't had some way of, we need to describe it as a probability variable, not just like evidence. But one way to say that would be maybe that there's no issues in common between the two pieces of evidence or the two arguments. They're about entirely separate things. Maybe that's the analog here. But there's no reason to assume that. And it's still, that's very different from the idea of witnesses being independent, which again, independent witnesses in the sense of non-collusory witnesses would still have highly dependent testimonies in the statistical sense, because they would co-vary a lot with each other. So that might seem like a technicality, but the reason I think that's important is because testimonial independence is a much weaker criterion than statistical independence, again, in the way that is relevant for Bayesian statistics. And I'm concerned here that by using the testimonial independence as a sort of an analogy, and granted, he wasn't saying that, he was saying that that was a way to get your intuition, but it's a bad way, right? Because then you might look at something and say, well, that's independent in like the testimonial sense, and then think it's independent in the statistical sense, which is not true. And then you might do silly things like multiplying the probabilities together, which is not a valid thing to do when they're not actually statistically independent of each other. So I think that's, I just really don't think that's a good way to describe it. But anyway, let's keep going.
So hopefully, that's a good
Welcome,
enough
Nathan.
intro to get going with the actual arguments.
Chad, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Ted, can you illustrate likelihood ratios using what's known as Royal's case as a gold standard of strong evidence?
Sure. So the original Royal's case, so this comes from Royal's book. I think I have it somewhere around here. Evidence, a likelihood paradigm. And so he wants to illustrate, what you can do with a likelihood ratio. So suppose your likelihood ratio has a numerical value of 8. And you think, well, what does that mean? That means in some sense or another, right, that the evidence strongly favors the hypothesis in the numerator, right? So in order to get a grip on this, think about another urn case. You're selecting 2 urns. There are 2 urns, and you're going to select a ball from the 2 urns. In the first urn, it's all white balls, and in the second urn, it's an equal mixture of black and white balls. Okay. Now you don't know, the urns are behind a screen, right? So you don't know which urn you're selecting from. But what you do,
I find this very tedious.
What you can learn too, evidence about the probability that you would select white on the first draw, right? So what that means is that you have 3 pieces of evidence, right, that are independent. You have the power, right, of that evidence is to multiply them together. So it'd be 2 times, And so what we can do is we can use.
So if I'm drawing balls out of an urn, I can reasonably assume that the probability that one is white is independent of the other one being white. Well, technically that's actually not true if I draw them without replacement, because I slightly change the probabilities each time. But if you replace it, or if the urn is very large, then it's close enough to being independent. That's all I really want to say about that. Again, totally different to assessing arguments for God. So I don't really know. I guess they're just defining basic terms, which is why I find this a bit tedious.
In this urn case, how many consecutive?
It's all about the urn.
Somewhere in the neighborhood of like 8.
And
sorry, Chad started
helpful
talking.
to note that using likelihood ratios, especially sort of the gold standard of 8 as being good evidence, is routinely used in the medical literature. I didn't know this until my wife told me. My wife's a doctor, and she's always reading these articles, and she always consults the likelihood ratios for correctly diagnosing some disease or some condition. And so she sent me a bunch of articles where likelihood ratios are discussed in diagnoses. And Ted, I think you had one about mammograms.
Yeah. So
how could you not know that likelihood ratios are used in the medical literature and really elsewhere in science? I don't understand how you can. I understand that that's not their area of specialty, right? But not even having the basic idea that like that's a thing that's used in that. Like, what did you think it was for? Just for just for Christian apologists to use? I don't. Whatever. Again, this is just not really important, to be honest. Oh, camera's disappeared.
This I can send you guys a handout later, maybe that you can link to in the comments or something, where people can look at the case. But it's a standard.
Yeah, that's pretty easy to do.
It's a standard case. I can read you the case if I can just let me see if I can. What kind of medical reasoning problem? Women, and it used to be routine to screen women 40.
Yeah, we don't need to go through this. Look, likelihood ratios are widely used in medicine and in other areas of science. That tells us nothing about their applicability to analyzing apologetics arguments, because you need to assess whether the criteria or the assumptions is a better word. You need to assess whether the assumptions are appropriate. And I've already highlighted 2. Where does the likelihood come from, and is independence satisfied? I mean, there's others as well, like how you define your random variables and what the sample space is and things like that, which I mean, they haven't even touched on here. Not saying they have to get into the full details, but they're presenting some aspects of the formalism, but not mentioning the other parts or glossing over some other parts, which are kind of important in terms of how do you apply it to using it to assess arguments. Maybe they're going to talk about it later. So, I mean, I'm not saying because I haven't finished the video yet, but the point is, the fact that it's used in medicine just tells us nothing. Let's move on.
What are called frequency trees?
Oh gosh, what was that?
Well, if the 1%
like,
number
subscribe,
is right,
facts again.
there's only going to be 10. Right, that
blah,
negative
blah.
given the numbers.
Yes.
Like no into consideration, like the prevalence, right, of
still going on this
literature of theistic argument.
Hang on.
I've been keeping tabs on theistic arguments for a long time now, and I've found that the best way to impose order on this vast literature of theistic arguments is to group them into two categories: traditional arguments on one side, and we have non-traditional arguments on the other. And then we have 7 categories of traditional arguments, and then 7 categories of non-traditional arguments. And so for traditional,
where did the number 7 come from? Wait, wait, as I say that, it occurs to me, isn't that like a Hebrew number for perfection or something? It's like, the biblical number. Is it an accident that there's 7 categories? Like, I mean, categorization's all great, but it's like, Chad has just said that, he's just said, and then there are 7 types of traditional and 7 types of non-traditional. Where does that come from? Like, why 7? If you're using your own categorization system, that's fine, but at least say something about like how you came up with it. Like if you're going to go all the effort of talking to us about the categorization, don't just skim over the part of how you decided to classify them that way. Like I don't get it. It's just like, oh, and then there are 7. Like, well, what? Why 7? Like this isn't a nitpick because this might be important, right? If arguments are in the same category, maybe that means that's an extra reason for thinking they're not independent of each other. Perhaps if they're in different enough categories, maybe we can have an argument for saying that they're independent. I mean, I don't know, right? But at least that would be something to look at. So the categorization is kind of important here, at least I would think. But we just didn't get an explanation of where the 7 came from.
Arguments we have, of course, cosmological, ontological, design, moral, miracles. And miracles, I just have in mind the historical claims to, like, say, resurrection or fulfilled prophecy, and also contemporary miracle claims and reports. And then we have 6 experiential arguments from religious experience, including near-death experiences. And we have pragmatic or prudential arguments, such as Pascal's wager. Now, before mentioning non-traditional arguments, I have a quick question for Ted, and that's how, Ted, how do you see arguments from miracles as fitting into a cumulative case for theism? I think in the last stream, you said that, for example, the argument for the resurrection should be brought in only on the heels of a good case for theism. But I'm not so sure about this. Sandra Menson, I think is her name, and Thomas Sullivan have this interesting book called The Agnostic Inquirer, where they argue that this is a mistaken approach. They give this example. Suppose we're trying to decide whether there's extraterrestrial intelligent beings out there, whether aliens exist. Clearly, it's reasonable to examine signals from outer space.
Sorry, I just said something, but it was muted. It doesn't matter. It's not important. We'll keep going.
To help settle that question. And this is, in fact, what SETI does, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So examining potential communications from aliens helps us judge whether or not aliens exist. Likewise, examining potential communications from God, such as revelation claims, can help us judge whether God exists. And so by considering potential revelation claims only after a case has been made for theism, they say that we could be ignoring the most important evidence for theism of all, maybe even the best evidence for theism. So what do you think? What do you think of that suggestion?
I'm very sympathetic to that suggestion. Hopefully, something I said isn't.
I'm shocked
with that. So one point to make is just, the fairly straightforward point is, like, if you already think you're rationally committed to there not being extraterrestrial life, right, then it's not going to be plausible, right, at all, right, to look for signs. I mean, that that's not going to make any sense, right? So in a Bayesian framework, you say something like, look, if you have probability 0, right, that a hypothesis is true, right, then the probability is.
But no one allocates a prior of 0. Come on.
And another sort of point in the neighborhood is just, well, if it's really close to 0, right, then you're going to have the same sort of situation where it would have to be extremely powerful evidence in order to move you significantly from something that, say, 10 to the negative, like 23 or something like that.
Yes, good point.
So the way I was thinking about it is that you have to look at, of course, the miracle reports and see what the evidence favors. But the way I think about it is that unless you already have a plausible hypothesis that there's a God, right, the evidence isn't going to be so overwhelming that it can't be interpreted in some other way. It's your standard, kind of, well, this is a misreport. We don't actually have the report about, what happened. It's a myth. There's some other explanation for it, and so on. Now, I do think. Go ahead.
I'll just throw this out there really quickly. So Tim McGrew and Lydia McGrew have an article that was published in the Blackwell Companion Natural Theology. The likelihood ratio that they arrive at that the resurrection happened is 10 over 44, or 10 to the 44.
10 to the 44. Yeah, I want
10 to the 44.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So they, and that's what they are. They don't even talk about the prior probability because they think that number is just so large that,
yeah,
you'd have to have some really, really good evidence that God doesn't exist in order. So that is that kind of your point, Chad?
Seriously, there's no pushback against that ridiculous, what was it, 10 to the 40 or 44 claim? I just, like, I thought that these guys who were spotted, what's his name, Ted, he's the cumulative case guy, right? He's all about Bayes' theorem. He's not going to push back against this ridiculous abuse of Bayes' theorem, because what they do to get to that likelihood ratio is just multiply. I don't remember how many witnesses it is that they use. It's at least 12, maybe 15 witnesses, and each one has like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100 probability of reporting seeing Jesus that they just pull out of thin air, and then they just multiply them all together because they're independent. And their argument for that is just a joke. And that's how they get to such a stupid likelihood ratio. I mean, any man and his dog can come up with a likelihood ratio that small just by plucking numbers out of thin air and multiplying them together. It's easy to do. Like, it's not serious scholarship. I mean, I suppose it's published in the Blackwell Companion. So, like, well, who am I to argue? But it's just pathetic. And it's really disappointing that we're not at least getting anything about that. Like, I was expecting a bit of pushback or saying something about the independence assumption or whatever. Like, the atheists can just do this about any arbitrary phenomenon. Like, let's say we take any evil that exists in the world. Anytime that there's been a murder or, well, hell, a genocide, like there's been enough of those. Let's say that there's a 1 in 1,000 probability that a good God would allow genocide, multiply out all the genocides, because, well, they've got a better case of being independent of each other than the reports of the of the witnesses, given that they all knew each other and talked to each other. How many genocides have there been? Like dozens throughout history, at least, that we've documented. There you go. I've just got like a massive likelihood ratio against the existence of God. Well, what QED? Like, I've proven that God doesn't exist. This is pathetic. This is just unbelievably stupid.
I guess so. I take it that their point in the book The Agnostic Inquirer is just that it's a mistake to rule out claims of revelation as belonging in the equation of evidence for God's existence, as if we should only consider those claims after we have a good case for theism, because those claims can be part of a good case for theism. So yeah. How you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to remember. I was talking to someone about this. I can't remember if it was in the earlier stream that we did. But Swinburne distinguishes between evidence that makes a claim more probable than not, and evidence that increases the probability of the claim, right? And so you can have, when I say something like, well, theism needs to be plausible, right, in order to sort of get significant.
You heard it here, folks. The numbers between 0 and 0.5 are different between the numbers of 0.5 up to 1. Like, probability works differently in those. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Swinburne had a deeper point than that, but this, like, probability works the same regardless of what side of 0.5 you are. Probability doesn't care about 0.5.
Confirmation from miracles and such, right? I'm thinking in a way of the final step, right? The making it more probable than not. And I certainly think that you could start off with, a relatively low probability, definitely less than 0.5, and then you add in the miracle reports, and that can raise the probability above 0.5.
Yeah. Okay, so that helps. So we have traditional arguments, and then we have non-traditional arguments. So here we have metaphysical arguments, and these are arguments from abstract objects, the nature of unities, the applicability of mathematics. We have Joshua Rasmussen's arguments from limits and arguments like these. Then we have nomological arguments from the laws of nature. And if you're interested in this argument, check out a flashy new paper in the journal Nous that was just published defending this argument. We have theological arguments based on mind-related phenomena such as consciousness, reason, and knowledge. We have axiological arguments, which are arguments based on non-moral kinds of value. So these are distinct from moral arguments. And non-moral kinds of value would be aesthetic value or deontic value. We have linguistic arguments based on certain facts about language and semantics. We have anthropological arguments, such as the argument from desire, meaning, love, the consensus gentium argument, the political argument.
The consensus gentium.
We have finally just the broad category of meta arguments. And here I would include transcendental arguments and Ted's argument from so many arguments. Another example would be our dear late friend Ben Arbor's argument that we have so many. The fact that we have so many arguments for theism should raise our credence in the possibility premise of the ontological argument, since an argument for the conclusion that God exists is an argument for the conclusion that God possibly exists. So having a lot of arguments for the conclusion that God exists is the same as having a lot of arguments for the conclusion that God possibly exists. Now, another question for Ted is, do you think of the...
Nice job at double counting your evidence there, Chad. You're like, well, we've got arguments that increase our credence, but then we use that to fit into another argument, which increases our credence. Like this, you don't double count evidence like that. I remember there was another paper that we came across where someone was arguing that you should double count evidence in this way. I can't remember which stream that was in, though. I did with Nathan, but that was interesting. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, yeah. The other thing is just that the way that Chad just rattles off all of those different categories there, it's just ridiculous. Like, I'm just grabbing my metaphysics book here and looking at how many of the different categories of like stuff that they talk about apparently support God's existence. So let's see, universals and particulars, yes, because he mentioned a Platonistic argument. Let's see, part 2 is on existence and identity. I'm not sure that would apply. Modality and possible worlds, not sure that would apply. Time and space, yeah, well, they think God created time and space. Events and causation, yeah, same thing. God's like their first cause, so that would apply. Nature of the mind, yeah, so God created all the minds, the argument from substance dualism and stuff that he mentioned there. Free will, yes, they argue that as well. And then there's the last category on anti-realism and vagueness, which is probably not applicable. So there's a bunch of stuff there. And I haven't even picked up my other books about like ethics and other things that they think are appealing. So it's like point to a random object, and then basically the category of things that studies that object, like whether it's biology, whether it's physics, whether it's ethics, whether it's anthropology, whether it's linguistics, whether it's philosophy of mind, whatever it is, like it all points to God. Like everything points to God according to some of these people. Like, how dogmatic do you have to be to think that every single facet of reality is actually evidence for a particular metaphysical thesis? I just don't. Like, it's one thing to say that the metaphysical thesis can account for all aspects of reality, but it's different to say that all those aspects provide evidence for that metaphysical thesis, interpreted as like a greater likelihood ratio relative to opponents. It's just like, what? Yeah, well, whatever.
Argument from so many arguments as its own distinct argument, or is it just sort of a cheeky name for a cumulative case? Just sort of being supervenient, as it were, on just all the arguments.
Yeah. No, I don't know how Plantinga thought of it originally when he introduced the term, right? So he has the argument from so many arguments. Like, there's so many arguments, and so that's an argument. I don't think of it as being a separate consideration, right?
Okay.
That raises probability.
Pretty sure Chad does.
Yeah. So this is what Plantinga says. It's only 2 lines. These arguments import a great deal of unity into the philosophic endeavor, and the idea of God helps with an astonishingly wide variety of cases. That's it.
Yeah, there's a quote that I think I put in one of my recent papers from let's see, it was I think the mathematician Neumann. He said something like, there has to be a God because it explains so much, right?
Yeah. Well, here's a way
Well, if Neumann said it, I don't get some theist obsession with quotes. Like, I had a debate yesterday with a Russian physicist, which I might put up on my channel, but he liked quoting as well. He quoted from Einstein and from I've forgotten who else, a bunch of other physicists and philosophers. It's like, what relevance does that have to anything? I just don't. Craig does this as well. He loves to quote random philosophers about things that they're not even necessarily experts on. Like, even if they are, like, well, give us their argument or the evidence. Don't just. Anyway, it just annoys me.
I guess you might think of it as a distinct argument. Is that if a grand theory is true, we would expect there to be multiple lines of evidence supporting it. So the fact that we do have multiple lines of evidence supporting theism is additional evidence for theism. I think that's a way of thinking about how this could be a distinct argument.
Perhaps. I'm a little worried about double counting, kind of.
Yes, you're just double counting your evidence.
And it is pretty powerful. Then that you have multiple lines of evidence, right? And it's pretty powerful. Doesn't seem to me, seems to me in a way unnecessary, but also, seems like, if I go to the bank and I say, hey, how much money do I have in the account? And they're like, oh yeah, you've got $200. And I'm like, oh, well, let me just write myself a check for $200 more. Right. Yeah. So it kind of feels like that to me.
Why don't we turn to talk about the difference between a good argument and a bad argument, because that's going to tie into the calculator that we're going to show.
Maybe should have started with that.
We're getting to it pretty quickly. So
Bayes' theorem tells you how to evaluate evidence, or how to update your beliefs on the basis of evidence, but it doesn't tell you it doesn't tell you about that evidence in the first place. Another way to put that is, it doesn't tell you where your likelihood comes from. You've got to put that into the calculation, and then the Bayes' theorem tells you how to update on the basis of that. So maybe let's start by talking about what makes a good argument, and then we'll talk about how to add up arguments. It seems like they put the cart before the horse here.
Why don't we talk about that?
Yeah, good. And the standards of good arguments are going to depend on the kind of argument. So a good inductive argument, like Ted said, it's one that makes a hypothesis or the conclusion more probable, either more probable than it was before, more probable than an alternative hypothesis, or more probable than not. The standard.
That's a crappy definition, because we're just using probability again. But if we're Bayesians, then probability is just like if we're full Bayesians. I haven't really talked about this yet, but Bayes' theorem is often used by Bayesian statisticians or people who buy into sort of Bayesian epistemology, which basically means that a probability is a degree of belief or a credence in some proposition. So if I assign a probability of 0.6 to something, it means say that I have a 60% credence in it, or that may represent odds that I'd be, or a probability that I'd be willing to bet on that thing would happen. That's another way it's sometimes understood. Now, the reason that's important here is because if you're going to say that evidence, or actually, sorry, an argument is a probability raiser, then that's kind of subjective, right? If you define probability in Bayesian terms, or in subjective terms, because that's basically just saying an argument is something that causes someone to update their credence. But there's no constraint on that, at least not in accord with what Chad said, on the fact that they've rationally updated their credences. Like, I could just give a piece of rhetoric that has no argumentative value whatsoever, but causes someone to update their credence in something. Now, you wouldn't say that that makes it a good argument just because it's caused someone to accord a higher credence or higher probability to a proposition. We want to make sure that they've rationally updated, not just that they've changed their credence. But the way that Chad has apparently defined it here, and granted it was only a short statement, but I think this is important. It doesn't place any rational constraints on it. It's merely, I mean, if he's using a subjectivist notion of probability, I mean, if he's not, then the question becomes, well, what do you mean by probability? Like, we can't really talk about frequentist terms of understandings of probability, because, like, it's not like God is an event that happens a bunch of times. We can add up, count the proportion of times God created the universe, or the proportion of times he didn't, or the proportion of times he resurrected Jesus and the proportion of time he didn't. So that just doesn't make sense. Most of these can't be accorded frequentist probabilities. So they can be accorded Bayesian probabilities because that's a credence, a degree of belief. But then the problem is, if you just define an argument as anything that raises your credence, then anything can be an argument, including purely emotional appeals. Now, I think he's going to want to build in a rationality requirement there, but I think that then that's going to be doing all the work. Like, what is it about an argument that causes it to raise the credence? Like where do you get how do you assign the likelihood to an argument, essentially? Like, where does that come from? What is it about the combination of premises that allows it to have a higher or a lower likelihood? I just think that I'm not saying he can't give that case, but he's leaving out all the things that matter from my point of view. What is it about an argument that makes it raise the probability? Because that's what we're really interested in.
Therefore, a good deductive argument is going to be different. It's got to be formally valid. The premises jointly entail the conclusion. It has to commit no informal fallacies, and it has true or plausibly true premises. Now, it's very important to note that a sound argument is not necessarily a good argument. For example, here's a sound argument that's not a good argument. Either my cat is named Lucifer, or 1 + 1 = 2. My cat is not named Lucifer, so 1 + 1 = 2. That follows from the two premises by disjunctive syllogism. It's indisputably formally valid in first-order logic, and the premises are true. But it's not a good argument. If you want an argument for thinking one.
Another example of arguments that may be sound but are also bad arguments. See also ontological arguments. Oh, shots fired there.
+ 1 = 2. This is not going to move you. So mere soundness is not enough to make an argument a good one. A good argument must have some other virtue or virtues that make it rational to believe the conclusion on the basis of the premise.
Okay, good. So he is building in a rationality requirement.
Dive into the philosophical literature on the nature of arguments. We just need this nice little heuristic that says that a good argument is one that's valid, commits no informal fallacies, and it's rational to believe the conclusion based on the premises. Now, it's important to.
Wait, hang on. I think you missed something there.
We just need this nice little heuristic that says that a good argument is one that's valid, commits no informal fallacies, and it's rational to believe the conclusion based on the premises. Now,
well, hang on. He didn't say anything about the premises being true. A good argument that's valid and commits no informal fallacies will still be a bad argument. Well, an argument that is valid and commits no informal fallacies will still be bad if the premises are all false, or even if one premise is false. And then if he's going to say, well, that it's, see, this is the problem. This goes back to the Oppie critique, right? If he's going to add, and it's also reasonable to believe the premises, then we're going to ask, for whom is it reasonable to believe the premises, given conditioning on what, like, data or what background beliefs? And the thing is, it might be rational for the person who already believes in theism to believe the premises, but not for the person who doesn't. So then we're just left at a standoff here, because they each have different background beliefs. So the way they update based on the argument is actually different. So the same argument by this definition would be good for some people and bad for others. The point is, it's relativized whether an argument is good or not. If you're going to depend on whether it's rational to believe in the premises or not, then that relativizes whether the argument is good or not. Now, Chad didn't actually say that. He just didn't even mention whether the premises are true. But that raises a further problem, because the explanation that he gave is just unsatisfactory, because it doesn't say anything about whether the premises are true, which is critical for evaluating an argument. So either way, if he just doesn't mention it, well, I think he's missing kind of the point of it. If he does mention it, I think that then is going to relativize whether an argument is good or not. And that raises the question as to, well, how do we evaluate these arguments? Like, what makes an argument good? You can't just say, well, if the premises are true or probably true, because then we can ask, well, according to whom? Because people are going to disagree about whether the premises are true depending on their background beliefs. And we're back to square one, effectively.
Now, it's important to bear these points in mind, generally about good arguments, but especially as we go on to talk about theistic arguments. So, Cameron, if you want to pull up the calculator that we have.
Oh,
there we go. And
bringing it
so we have this calculator. This is based on the math that Ted lays out in his paper. And I want to ask Ted, what do you think of these likelihood ratio estimates for weak, decent, and strong?
They're made up.
Is showing up as a
They're
median
completely
there.
invented.
Obviously, you have to have something above just 1 point something in order for it to count as anything, or else it's either neutral or anything less than that is no evidence at all.
No. Oh my gosh. If the value is exactly 1, then it's not evidence for or against a hypothesis. If the argument is, if the likelihood ratio is less than 1, then then that is evidence for the contrary, whatever the alternative is. It's evidence against the hypothesis. And this was my criticism of their original spreadsheet. It doesn't allow for any arguments against. The version that I did in my 500 arguments video that I did with Nathan allows for arguments for and against theism or atheism, whichever way you do it, because you can put in numbers higher than 1 and numbers less than 1, and then it will incorporate them both. This doesn't do that. But the point is, a number less than 1 is not just like irrelevant. It's an argument against, and that's actually how you should evaluate this. You should consider for and against. It's such a basic point.
You think of those ranges there? I've just kind of toyed with myself as being.
Yeah, you made them up
for weak, decent, or medium, and strong arguments.
Yeah, that can work.
And even if those likelihood ratios are taken from the literature, which may be because there are heuristics that are used in the medical literature and others, the point is you still have to decide whether an argument, like a philosophical argument, counts as weak, strong, or medium. And in that case, you're assigning it a likelihood ratio, which is entirely invented. Like, how did you assign likelihood ratios are supposed to be based on statistical evidence, not based on making things up? Now, there is a way around this, which is to say, look, the likelihood ratios just reflect my subjective degree of belief that the argument is sound, or the argument is sound. And that is actually fine. You can do that in Bayesian statistics if you're treating the probabilities as degrees of belief for you based on your beliefs, and then you can apply this. You still have the independence problem, but putting that aside, then this would be fine. However, if that is the case, then all that this number would be is the likelihood ratio that Chad gets when he thinks about these arguments based on his set of beliefs. It wouldn't have anything to do with what I should believe, because I evaluate the arguments differently based on my set of beliefs and my background evidences. And so my likelihoods are going to be different to his because I'm conditioning on a different set of beliefs, like a different set of data, effectively. So the point is, the only way to defend this, as far as I can see, is to say that this is working in the subjective Bayesian land with degrees of belief, and that's okay. Well, you still got the independence problem, but then that doesn't actually tell us anything about what anyone else should believe. This is just like what Chad should believe, or whoever fills this out, whoever assigns the likelihood values basically to the arguments. If this is supposed to be more objective than that, it's supposed to be relevant to other people, then we need some more argument, first of all, about what the probabilities even represent, because it doesn't seem that they can represent frequencies or subjective credences. I know that there's a school called objective Bayesianism, but honestly, I don't really understand how that works. So, I mean, maybe there's an argument to be given there, but that would need to be outlined, right? So we need an explanation of what the probabilities even mean. And then secondly, we need an explanation as to how the probabilities, the likelihood ratios, have been assigned to individual arguments on the basis of what? Because if they've just been pulled out of, somewhere not very nice, then we can just dismiss them equally flippantly, right?
Now, just a note, in the paper I use log likelihood ratios as opposed to likelihood ratios. Are these just the straight likelihood ratios?
These are the likelihood ratios, yeah.
Okay. So strong has a range of 3.1 to 8. Is that the idea?
Yeah, because 8 was our gold standard of good evidence. It's the equivalent of drawing 3 white balls from the urns. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's fine. I would, maybe just put strong as 8 and then medium as 3 and weak as, close to 1.
Close to 1.
Yeah.
Should I update these?
If you want. I mean,
so right now,
Bayesianism is also a philosophy of probability, which I guess is sort of related to the axioms, but it also relates to interpreting probability claims. But I don't want to get too involved in that. It's just that the point is that there needs to be assigning probabilities to arguments is really problematic because it's highly unclear what that means. So you need to be very careful about your interpretation of probability. This issue doesn't come up when Bayesian statistics are used in many real-world applications, because it's clear what the probabilities mean. Like they can just be they can be understood on the basis of samples that have been taken, like actual data, and you can calculate variances and all the usual stuff. So we can work from those probabilities. So basically, frequentist probabilities, how often something happens in a given set. But here, there's no such sampling that occurs, so we can't use that to ground our probabilities. There are other ways to do it, but they need to be fleshed out and explained, and it's just not being done. So these numbers are just meaningless, and then they're being combined in meaningless ways because they're not independent. Well, probably not. It's meaningless on top of meaninglessness. It's just absolute twaddle.
Now, just let me, right now you have strong evidence as likelihood ratio of 3.1 and medium. So you're going with the lower ranges of the figures?
Yeah, I'm just, if something exceeds a likelihood ratio of 3, I think we're getting into the territory of a strong argument.
Okay.
That's the way I was thinking of it. But of course, I mean,
yeah. I don't care about
how
that.
likely is a piece of it's a nice sort of formal way of developing the debate, right? To where we can say, hey, we've made some headway on this.
No, it's not a good way because you need an objective, principled way of assigning likelihood ratios to arguments. What is that method? I'm not saying it's impossible to have a method like that, mind you. I'm interested in that side of things, but we need to hear that. Like, it's important. You can't just skip that step, which they have. It's 40 minutes in. We haven't heard anything about how do you assign a likelihood ratio to an argument in an objective way. The only way I can come up with is to say that it represents your subjective degree of belief in the soundness of that argument. They didn't even mention that. That was me coming up with that. But that would be useless for any use of this other than describing your own set of beliefs. It wouldn't be useful for persuading anyone else because the likelihood ratios would be subjective to you and your particular set of beliefs. How come we haven't heard about this? Well, we've still got a little ways to go, so maybe they'll talk about it then.
Now agree.
Let's stay optimistic.
The evidence, favors theism or favors naturalism, right? Within this range, right? And just to give you an example of this, like a lot of people, I think the consensus now in philosophy of religion is that theism, given the evidence of fine tuning, right, that is more likely on theism than it is on single universe naturalism, right? So that likelihood ratio is going to be incredibly favorable to theism.
Whoa. I accept that many philosophers of religion do think that the likelihood ratio of theism the likelihood ratio of apparent fine-tuning with respect to the hypothesis of theism compared to apparent fine-tuning under single universe naturalism is a fair bit higher than 1. That is, that apparent fine-tuning provides evidence for theism over single universe naturalism. Many people do think that, including many atheists. I don't, right? But many people do think that. But it doesn't follow that the likelihood ratio is way higher than 1. This is what I objected with Luke Barnes. Just because you can get high, very low probabilities of fine-tuning, it doesn't mean that the likelihood ratio is equally high or low, whichever way you think about it. Because the likelihood ratio isn't just the same as the probabilities that you assess. There's a lot more that goes into that calculation. So this is too hasty here. Just because people generally agree that perhaps fine-tuning is evidence for theism over single universe naturalism, it doesn't mean that it's a very high likelihood ratio. It just means it's more than 1. Again, this is the problem here. What is the method for calculating these likelihood ratios?
So to give the listeners some sense
I haven't watched this video before.
Can have an ampliative effect. How do you want to play with the numbers here, Ted? 22 dozen or so weak arguments, medium arguments, strong arguments. How do you see the landscape of theistic arguments in terms of strength?
So this is a nice way to accommodate lots of different judgments, right? So you can say, all right, well, how many theistic arguments do you think are plausible? Right? Are you on board with, you think, cosmological argument,
3
teleological argument,
out of the 100?
Consciousness, right? Maybe that gives us 4.
Not 0, but it's not very many.
Like you think, okay, those are the 4, and they are pretty strong evidence for theism. So in that case, what you would do is I would actually put the strong, I think 3 is for a value in that case is right. And so
I'm skipping ahead forward a bit because they're just making up numbers here.
Probability of God is a half. Right. Then
why would it be half?
Where
does half come from? Just because there's 2 options doesn't mean it should be half. Like, how can I explain this in a clear way? So, okay, I have a hypothesis that there are 3 pixies under my desk dancing. No, they're not dancing. They're doing the hula hoop. They're doing hula hoops, right? I've got 3 pixies on my desk. Okay, so either that proposition is true or false. And we don't really have a lot of particular evidence about that either way. You can't see under my desk, right? You've never been to my house. You don't know what's there. So surely we're going to go 50-50, prior of 50%, right? About whether there's 3 pixies doing the hula hoop under my desk, right? No, that's silly, right? Because the reason it's silly is because you have a bunch of background beliefs about, well, hula hoops and pixies and desks and all stuff like that. That's going to mean we're not going to think that those are equally likely. And likewise, we're almost certainly going to have a whole bunch of beliefs about or like literally anything in philosophy and science as well for that matter, which mean that it's unlikely that we're going to assign the probability that God exists at 50%. I mean, even putting aside how we define God, but I mean, why would you assign that? Different people are, of course, going to give different probabilities. Now, you might want to say, well, look, just imagine that we're considering the prior probability before considering any arguments or any issue in philosophy. But that's silly because no one's in that position. And even if you were, I'm not sure why 50% would be the baseline anyway, because give back my hula hoop pixie example, right? Let's say that we forget about all of our beliefs about hula hoops and desks and everything else in science. In that case, would you accord a prior of 50% to that proposition? No, it's silly. It's concocted, and also there's a problem there because you can construct propositions in inconsistent ways. Like I could conjunct that with there's pixies under my desk and there's pixies in the Sahara dancing, right? And then you can't give that 50% because then the two conjuncts in together must be more likely than I don't explain that very well. Both things together have to be less likely than either thing by itself. And so if I accord all of them at 50%, there's an inconsistency there. So the point I'm making is just that 50% is just arbitrary. Like it's very hard to give a real justification to why the price should be 50%. And it really annoys me that in these sort of contexts, theists usually want to jump to 50% because many of them are going to be quite happy if they can get the posterior up to just like 90% or something like that. That's actually going to be good enough for them for a lot of their purposes, although they'll often push it further than that. But getting to 90% from 50% is actually not that hard, right? It's only a small shift. So from my point of view, 50% is already far too generous for a prior. I'm not going to say it should be 0 or anything, but 50% is almost all of the apologist work done for them, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm not going to grant that so readily. Certainly not before we've even had a discussion about what it means to set a prior in this context. Like prior to what? But anyway, let's keep going.
That are fairly strong arguments, even given what I said, that 3.1 is relatively modest. You end up with an overwhelming posterior probability. Right, of theism. And this is something I think I mentioned in an earlier stream. This is, I find this stuff really fascinating because you start off with relatively modest assumptions, and you end up with, thinking, wow, the final probability in theism is 0.989. I mean, that's overwhelmingly, overwhelmingly probable.
Right. One thing that Cameron and I ran into when we played with these numbers before is that it's actually challenging to get a cumulative case of these arguments that doesn't end up with a total final probability of above 0.5 for God's existence.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, when you work through the details of the arguments and you think
it's trivially easy. Nathan and I did that on our stream. It's just all about what numbers you put in. Come on. Can I find 100 numbers, because there's like 150 numbers, such that when you multiply them all together and then times it by the prior, the result is less than 0.5. It's trivially easy to do. You just take 0.5 and you just take n to the power of 154 equals 0.5 and solve for that. Like they just need to be low enough, right, to do that. Obviously they think it's hard, or at least Chad thinks it's hard, because he thinks these arguments are all so good. So he's multiplying all of these strong and medium arguments. And when you do that, then yeah, you're going to get high likelihood ratios. But all this is saying is that if you believe the arguments are good, then you're going to be convinced in the conclusion. But that doesn't tell us anything. That we already knew that. How does this add anything to the discourse? How does this help us reach the answer? How does this clarify anything?
All right, well, I agree. This strong argument, I agree. That's a strong argument. I agree. That's a strong argument. It's very difficult to, capture what I think, if you asked, a lot of people, I don't know if they said this publicly, but if you were to ask a lot of philosophers, like how strong do you think the case is for theism? I mean, a lot of people are going to say there's just no case. It's relatively weak. Right. But even, among theists, they'll say, oh, it's fairly strong. It's not as strong as, you might think, but it will make something like,
well, that's certainly not what William Lane Craig says, and many other apologists that I've heard talk about this, because they typically say that the case is overwhelming. Not 100%, of course. Any sensible person wouldn't say that, but they'll say it's pretty overwhelming, especially people like Chad, who thinks that literally any piece of reality, like anything you look at, that phenomenon, everything from trees to persons to cars to numbers, like literally everything points to God. Well, the case isn't not as good as you might think, but still okay. The case is overwhelming for these people. So anyway, I mean, yeah.
It's plausible that there's a God,
that's important,
and so on. So maybe if you think about this in probability, it gets you somewhere in the middle range. But when you actually plug in the numbers and work it out, it's tough to
what numbers
avoid the conclusion that
what numbers
of theism is fairly high.
When you plug in what numbers? You've just made these numbers up. First of all, the number of arguments that you get is arbitrary because you're just plucking things out of journals. Like, there's no control as to what counts as an argument, apart from that it was published in a journal, which is a crappy control, because it's like, you look at many of them are just slight tweaks on the same fundamental argument. Why do those count as different arguments? Well, that gets us, I guess, to the independence assumption, which has largely been ignored. But even more important than that, the likelihood ratios have just been plucked out of thin air. At best, you can say that they've taken like the 8, for example, from applications of Bayesian statistics in medicine or something like that. But that 8 has a specific meaning. It's used as strong evidence because of basically it's a heuristic based on past examples and how much evidence is, the sample sizes and effect sizes and things like that in medical trials that have been done in the past. That's how these sort of heuristics are justified. Ideally, I mean, some of them aren't really justified, but like in frequentists, it's 0.05, like 95%. That's kind of arbitrary, but it's still useful as a baseline for assessing how good something is. But the problem is when we're taking that out from a context in which this is well developed and we know what we're doing to context where we have no idea what we're doing, like applying these numbers to deductive arguments, it literally makes no sense at all because they're just pulling these numbers out of nowhere. How can he say when you plug these numbers in, it's hard to avoid the conclusion? What numbers?
Another way to, I was just saying, another way to kind of cool thing to think about this is think about the case for naturalism too, right? And you think, be even-handed here, and you think, okay, well, look, if these are the cases that theists give, then let's think about the cases, right, that naturalists or atheists give. And then we can model those as likelihood ratios too.
I did.
And you can add them all in, right?
I did that in my 500 arguments video.
4 strong arguments for theism, and there are 2 strong arguments for atheism. Well, that would be as if we had 2 strong arguments, right? You just subtract them off, and then you can just run your numbers and just see where you're at, right? So even in that case, right? You give, you say, hey, theism has 4 strong arguments, atheism, maybe hiddenness and evil, right? What does that do to your final probability? And as Cameron just updated and shows, I mean, it moved you from.
Enigma Conjecture says, James is heavily biased towards physicalism, so of course all arguments for God are bunk to him. Now, Enigma's got a point there. I am biased towards physicalism because that's what I think is the case. And so unsurprisingly, I think that actually it's not true that I think all arguments for God are bunk, but I don't think any of them are very good, and most of them are bunk. There's a few that are okay. But that's the point, right? When I do this, obviously I'm going to assign low likelihood ratios to these arguments. When Christian apologists do this, they assign much higher likelihood ratios. So what is the point of this whole exercise? Everyone is just putting in what they already believe. It doesn't tell you anything new. This is the whole point of the stream is, depending on your set of beliefs, you're going to assign different likelihood ratios because there's no objective way that's been articulated or I've ever heard of to assign these likelihood ratios to arguments. And therefore, what you get out is really just exactly what you put into it. There is no value to this process.
0.98 to 0.9, which is, I just
think about the other 150 that we did in our stream.
Yeah. So I think this is just, I love this stuff. It's a lot of fun to, use to model, judgments.
Mm-hmm. And, I think for a lot of people looking at this,
I'm actually interested in modeling judgments, and this doesn't model judgments. This doesn't model anything. All you're doing is sticking numbers into a spreadsheet and then multiplying the likelihood ratios together. I mean, I guess that's a model in the crudest sense, but that's not modeling the judgment process, because we haven't modeled how you actually assign those likelihood ratios to the arguments. That's the interesting bit. How do you get that number in the first place? What determines what's a strong, what's a medium, what's a weak? If it's pure subjective assessment, then for a start, that's almost certainly not going to be independent because you're relying on your background beliefs to do that. But also, everyone's just bringing their biases and their preconceived notions into that already. So yeah, when I look at it, I don't think that they're persuasive because I have my own set of biases and preconceptions and ways of looking at things. And then when William Craig or when Chad or whoever else looks at this and they bring their own set of preconceptions and they assign their own likelihood ratio. So the whole thing is pointless. That's my point here. I just don't understand how they don't see this.
Calculator. And and we're looking at a list of theistic arguments. Say we have 150 here with varying degrees of strength.
So you agree with me, Enigma? We're agreed then.
We look at another list, a list of arguments for naturalism, and I've seen some of these lists being batted about on online too. Now I think it's going to come down to this starting probability of God's existence, right? This is going to be a huge controlling factor for the total probability that God exists. So, and this is where we transition to some of your more recent work, Ted, on the intrinsic probability of grand explanatory theories. So would you tell us just a little bit about, remind us what the intrinsic probability of a theory is, and then tell us what's different about when we consider the intrinsic probability of a grand explanatory theory.
Yeah. So intrinsic probability is just another way of talking about prior probability. Right. So in the mammogram example, the prior probability that a woman in her 40s has breast cancer is 0.01, right, 1%. When we talk about the intrinsic probability of a grand theory, we're talking about its probability prior to any evidence. Right. So grand theory is a theory that explains the nature, the existence and the nature of the universe. Right. There are several different grand theories. Theism is one. Naturalism is another. And so you just think.
Can you give me an example of a third one? Because these are the only two that most apologists ever talk about. I'd be interested in what a third, maybe idealism, I guess, but they hardly ever talk about that anyway. So, anyways.
Okay, well, what is its probability prior to considering any evidence? And as you mentioned, I mean, a lot of people have different judgments about this. One of the
shocking. People disagree.
That naturalist offers is something along the line of Russell's teapot. Right, example is that the probability of God is just overwhelmingly improbable. It's like positing a teapot that is somewhere in between the sun and Mercury. So this would be something that would be completely unobservable when Russell was writing this, and completely implausible. Right, and if you think of the hypothesis of theism as the posit, as that example, right, you're going to think in a way it's ridiculous to look for evidence for such thing because it's just so vastly improbable.
And now you take issue when it comes to the question of determining the intrinsic probability of a theory. The usual way, defended by Swinburne and others, is by comparing the theories. We have multiple theories, comparing their degree of simplicity. And of course, Swinburne is the simplicity guy. And so what is your main contention with this way?
That is a good way to look at the. I don't like intrinsic probability. I'd probably just prefer to say prior probability. That is a good way to look at prior probability, or to try to judge prior probabilities. Although then you have to have a way of defining simplicity, which is difficult. There are formal ways to do this. Of course, none of them will apply to theism because theism is not a formal hypothesis. Like in physics and in other quantifiable disciplines, you can. I don't want to be too technical about this, but there's ways of quantifying the simplicity of a hypothesis on the basis of how long it would take to specify, like the number of bits it would take to fully specify the state of affairs that the hypothesis posits. So basically, the more things that the hypothesis says have to be the case, then the more complex it is, because it's sort of saying more stuff. It's making more claims on reality, if you like. But that can only be done if there's a formal way of quantifying like the different states of affairs. And that just doesn't apply to, well, really any non-natural hypothesis, I would say, which incidentally, I think is an interesting argument that could potentially be used against the cogency of non-naturalistic hypotheses. But that's another kettle of worms. That's just something I like to mix my metaphors, don't I? Kettle of worms. That's just something I've been thinking about recently. But the point is that typical measures of quantifying simplicity don't really work for theism, because there's just a complete lack of structure about what the hypothesis is and can't really be quantified in any meaningful way. So therefore, how do we do it? Well, we have to use heuristic or qualitative methods, and that's fine, except for like you've got to give a story about how to do that. And unsurprisingly, the theists and the atheists don't agree about that. So aren't we back to square one? I mean, how have we made any progress? The other thing I want to say about prior probabilities, I mentioned before, prior to any evidence. How do you know what the probability is prior to any evidence? How do you extract all evidence from your mind and look at only the things, like only the non-evidential bits? Like I mean, maybe this is my empiricism coming across, but I think this is ridiculous. This is like asking what's a good example here? Like, what is the prior probability that Paris will be the capital of France, absent any evidence about like France and Paris? Like, what could that possibly mean? Like, how can you assess something like that? How can you extract all of the relevant things you know about France and Paris and whatever else, and just give a prior probability assessment? I mean, I don't know. Maybe you can come up with something, but I mean, even that case seems to be more well defined than the case of God. But you see what I'm pointing to here. How can you possibly get to a stage cognitively where you've somehow extracted, or like hypothetically extracted, all of the empirical evidence you have about the world that you'd have to do to assess the probability of God? I don't think you can do it. I don't think anyone knows how to do that. I don't even know that it even means anything, because you probably wouldn't have the concepts to work with. But so I think it's probably impossible to even do this. And even if you could, then there's an issue of still defining like the actual mechanism of assessing the definition of what counts as simplicity here. So he's going to raise some objections about this, which I may or may not agree with. But I don't think that this notion of, we just got to really find out what the prior probability or the intrinsic probability of God is or theism is going to get us anywhere, because no one's going to agree on this because everyone's using evidence, even maybe subconsciously, that they have and conclusions they've drawn to assess that prior plausibility.
Way of determining intrinsic probability of a theory.
That's a really good question. So I can give you a really long answer or give you a short answer. I'll try to sort of.
I need both.
You need both. What do you want to start with? So the short answer is that simplicity is supposed to be a very special kind of virtue. So it's supposed to be kind of a logical objective property of theories, right? It's not supposed to be like a psychological judgment or heuristic value. It's not supposed to reflect something about human psychology. And in virtue of it being kind of a logical objective feature of theories, right? You want to say, okay, well, tell me about the logic of simplicity. And the problem is just that no one has really offered a successful account of simplicity.
Don't you think that people might disagree on whether the accounts offered of simplicity are successful? I mean, if you say everyone agrees on it, or like it's widely accepted, then sure, I think that that's the case. But that's silly. Every concept we have is up for grabs in philosophy. Morality, causation, space and time, individual identity, abstract objects like number. Everything is up for grabs. Like, if I just hate this selective skepticism. It's like when I want to appeal to an idea, like just the things I mentioned, I'll just grab it and use it without worrying too much. But when I don't like an idea that's being deployed against me, I'm going to say, well, in philosophy, no one's actually been able to give a successful analysis of this concept. So, we should be cautious about using this, or we should sort of put that to the side. That's dumb. You won't. There's nothing left if you do that in philosophy. You won't have anything to appeal to. Like, everything is up for grabs in philosophy.
It seems much more akin to kind of a natural judgment, maybe reflecting, like a heuristic virtue or such.
The law of non-contradiction is not a counterexample to things that have been disputed in philosophy. I'm not sure if that was intended to be or not, but everything is up for grabs.
I'm sort of open but cautious about simplicity. I'm
okay, open but cautious. Fair.
He's gonna fight you over that. He's gonna
Oh yeah.
Fight you.
No, he's probably gonna send me a nasty email in a little bit.
So it's not that you reject simplicity. This actually gets to a question I want to ask.
Look, being open but cautious is fair, but I would like to see that applied more consistently. Notice they didn't say anything about that with respect to Bayes' theorem, even though I could make precisely the same argument about probability. No one has been able to give a successful account of what probability is because people disagree about this. There's your frequentists, there's your Bayesians, or like subjective probabilities. There's impetus theory. I think those are the three main ones. It's the same story there. People disagree about what probability judgments are, and I mentioned that before, right? But he didn't seem to have a problem with that when it's appealing to Bayes' theorem. But now that simplicity comes into the picture, for some reason he's more cautious. I don't mind caution when we're appealing to these concepts that are not well understood. I think that that's entirely appropriate. By the way, I think that leads you to lower your credence in God. But the selectivity here, I think, is hard to justify. Like, they were talking for a long time about Bayes' theorem and its applicability, and we got no discussion about any of the problematic philosophical aspects, some of which I mentioned. But then simplicity comes in, and we got to mention those. How do you justify that?
You in a minute. It's that. But before that, can you put on the table for us your alternative to simplicity for determining a theory's intrinsic probability?
Yeah. So just as a background note, some people have said this isn't an alternative to simplicity. This is just a different way of thinking about simplicity, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I'm like, okay, whatever. I just think that explanation is a very epistemically powerful way of coming to believe something. That something explains, a body of evidence, right, is very good, reason to believe.
But Ted, don't you know that explanation or explanatory power is actually quite contested philosophically, and no one has been able to put forward a successful theory of what an explanation is? And I'm being sarcastic there, but I'm not like that's true, right? I'm being sarcastic because, again, I think he's being inconsistent here. He doesn't want to appeal to simplicity because that's sort of philosophically problematic. People give different accounts, there's problems, sure. But then he's happy to appeal to explanation or explanatory power, but which is in the same basket. Now, maybe he's going to mention that. It's totally fine, by the way, to say, look, there's these two problematic concepts, but I think this one is a bit better or can be made clearer, so I'm going to pick that one over this one. That's totally fine, and how I think good philosophy progresses. So maybe he's going to say that. So maybe he's going to say that they're both kind of a bit problematic, but he thinks explanation is a better one. So let's hear it. Maybe I've been too mean.
Right, that hypothesis. And when we are engaged in explanatory reasoning, we're very sensitive to contingency judgments, and things that lack deep structural explanation strike us as very implausible.
Sounds good.
And so my idea is that we use these contingency judgments, right, to in a way limit the space of options that we're going to give positive probability. So just to give an example, right? Suppose someone claimed that it's an ultimate fact of the universe that 13 demigods exist, right? And you think 13, why not 12? Why 14? Why not 14? What kind of powers do they have? And they're like, yeah, well, there's one McArm guy and one McEar guy, and and you're just like, this is just absurd. Like, so at that point, I just think,
do I even have to give the parody argument there? I feel like all of my listeners are going to be intelligent enough to know exactly what I would say as a parody of Christianity in response to that. So I don't even need to say it. Just yeah, you know what I'm going to say, and just insert that here.
Look, that some people think, well, it's a view, give it some positive probability. I'm saying, no, don't give it any probability, right? It's not a contender. And if you buy that move, then you get rid of one objection to thinking about the intrinsic probability of grand theories, and that is that there's just an infinite number of them, right? And if you give them all positive probability, it ends up that they have probability 0, right, on anything like a normalized measure. And if they have, you could go infinitesimal, but then you're back into the same sort of problem that I've been worrying about for a while, is that if it's so close to 0, right, then the evidence, right, isn't going to do much, right, to boost your final probability.
So I really like the fact, let me jump in here real quick.
Look, I gave him a chance. He didn't say anything about the fact that explanatory power or explanation is philosophically problematic. So I'm going to push I gave him a chance. I was like, look, maybe he's going to say that, but he didn't. He didn't say anything about that. He may have written elsewhere about that, but it needed to be said here. We don't need all the detail, but that needed to be said. Look, if you're going to say simplicity is too problematic, I'm going to use explanatory power instead. I mean, they're not necessarily in conflict, right? But he wanted to use that in this, he wanted to contrast them here. We need a story. We need something as to why one is better than the other when both are philosophically contested. You can't just say one is philosophically contested, so I'm not going to use it, and then appeal the other when that's equally philosophically contested. Maybe even more so. I don't know, but certainly they're both highly contested, as most things are philosophically. So this is, look, he's a smart guy. Like, I don't know how he must know that. Like, I really don't get that. I'm guessing he's probably got more to say on this that he's not mentioning here, but I maintain it needed to be said here, even if in brief. I understand you don't have the time to go into all the details, but for people who, this is all they're going to see, it's just about being intellectually honest. Like, if there's two things that are contested and you want to say one is bad because it's contested and don't mention that the other one is contested, that is a problem. By the way, William Lane Craig does this. When he doesn't like something, he'll say that's contested, so you can't appeal to it. But whenever he puts forward positions, which almost always are contested, he never says this. Or he'll say, well, just because it's contested doesn't mean that we shouldn't believe in it, like things like that. So I have a real problem with that. And this is about using consistent standards. If you problematize one concept, you must problematize other concepts that are equally problematic on the basis of whatever criterion you've used to establish it being problematic. Here in this video, we've had a problematization of simplicity, but not a problematization of explanatory power. We've had a problematization of simplicity, but no problematization of philosophy of probability, or like what probability judgments mean. You see the problem here. They're just cherry picking. They're being selective about what they're going to analyze and what they're just going to take for granted.
Chad, don't lose your question. I'm also really happy about your internet seems to be, there was one point where it was kind of going in and out, but it seems to be doing really well. So I'm really happy about that. So let me just let the audience, it's been actually, I'm really surprised at how quickly we've moved through a lot of this material, and I've been watching the live chat to see what you guys have to say about the stream today. So there have been some objections that have come up, and we've kind of dealt with some of those. But if you have a question for either of my guests, either Dr. Chad McIntosh or Dr. Ted Poston, then let me know in the live chat. We've also got a couple super chats we'll get to as quickly as we can. But I do want to open it up to some questions. If you guys have questions, objections about like the way that we're doing this, a lot of people have been talking about the prior probability. We haven't talked enough about the prior, which we did talk about it fairly recently, right before we started talking about. Well, I guess we're still talking about it.
So I'm going to be rude here. Why is Cameron here? He hasn't added anything to the discussion apart from annoying interruptions. I mean, okay, it's his channel, sure, but you don't actually like. I mean, I suppose to be fair, some of the time he has just put the Ted and Ted and Chad next to each other. But I mean, I feel like it would have been better if he just introduced them and then buggered off. I don't know. I guess that's a bit rude, but I felt this interruption was annoying because I was listening to what they were saying, and I don't think he adds anything to this.
So. Yeah, I just wanted to open it up to some Q&A and objections. If you've got some objections to what we're talking about today, leave them in the live chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it. And
yeah, why no push-ups?
So the way you put this in your paper, Ted, is the best way, or your preferred way of thinking about determining the prior probability of a grand explanatory theory is that it should posit as few properties with finite limits as possible. So avoid.
Whoa! Finite limits? Why do infinite properties get a pass? Maybe he's going to say so. Let's hope.
Brute limitations. Now, one question very quickly I had about this is that suppose you have two theories and they are equivalent with respect to the number of brute limits that they posit. And in your example, the brute limit was 13 demigods, right? Why 13? You know, and why do they have the powers that they do? That seems to be like a brute limit that's unexplained. That makes the theory ad hoc and so forth.
Oh, not this limit crap again. Look, I don't know why they talk about limits as if they're positive properties. I mean, maybe there's a metaphysic you can come up with, but I don't see it this way, and I don't see the argument. Let me try to explain this, okay? I don't have the property, at least I wouldn't say that I do, maybe some people do. I don't have the property of like not being able to pick up the moon, let's say, because the moon's too heavy and too far away. That's not a thing that I have that makes me unable to pick up the moon. I just lack that property, or lack the power or the causal ability, however you want to define it, right? I lack that ability. And therefore I can't do it because I lack that power. So a limit is not a thing that you have that is kind of there. I mean, even if you think, some people don't think even properties exist, right? But I'm not even talking about that. I'm just saying, like, I don't see limits as like positive things in themselves. If some entity is limited in what it can do, like say it can't travel faster than the speed of light, that's not because it has some property that like slows it down, if you see what I mean. It just means it lacks the property of being able to travel that fast. Or, you know, I lack the property of being able to pick up the moon, or the power to do that. Whatever case you want to give, you know, my process is only so fast, so it lacks the power. It's not like there's a limit that somehow is put on it that makes it not have a property. It just, a limit is an absence of a property, not something positive in and of itself. Now that might seem more metaphysical than I like to usually get, right? But the point I'm making there is I don't see why infinities are important there, because they want to say, look, an infinity doesn't have a limit, so there's no thing that you put on there. But limits aren't things in our ontology. They're just the absence of something. So if I have a god who has the power to do this and that and the other thing, then I need to explain why he has those powers. The way they want to say it is that all you have to explain is why God is limited. Like, what they want to say, that you only need to explain why he doesn't have the power to do the things that he can't do, not why he does have the power to do the things that he can do. This is a shifting of the burden of proof, as far as I can tell, because they want to say God is infinite and all, like his attributes are infinite, right? And so there's no limits on him, and so you don't have to explain anything. But limits aren't like things that exist. They're the absence of things. God has all of these properties. And in fact, they're all maximally instantiated because they're like all infinite. So you need to explain all of them. Why does he have all these properties? Why is he omniscient and omnipotent and all good and non-spatial, like whatever other properties your God has? Why does he have all these properties? Not just those, but also his decisions. Like, why does he want to do this? Why does he want to do that? Why does he have his particular interests and desires, or if he has desires, or the actions that he takes? I mean, depends on your theology, of course. But the point is, it's not, limits aren't something that you have to explain. Or what you need to explain is the particular causal powers and properties and choices or whatever that the entity has. By defining it in terms of limits, they're trying to avert or reverse the burden of proof, as far as I can tell, because they want to say that they don't have, there's no implausibility or no explanation necessary for unlimited properties. But that's just ad hoc. Why don't they need it? They're still there. You still need to explain them. It's not the limit that needs to be explained. It's the thing that actually does exist, like the causal powers or properties that your entity does actually have. So if I'm looking at my processor, I don't need to explain why it's not 5 gigahertz. I need to explain why it is whatever speed that it is, that it does have. You see the difference? You don't need to explain what doesn't exist. You need to explain what does exist. And that seems to be completely flipped in what they're saying here. And I just want an explanation for why why we're doing it that way, because it seems like they've cooked the books just so it can work in God's favor.
So, but suppose we have two theories that are equivalent with respect to the number of root limits that they have. And so they're equally intrinsically probable. But now suppose that one of those theories is simpler than the other. Does that change the probability comparison for you?
Yeah, I'd want to hear a specific case.
Yeah.
So, Swinburne, for example, uses a criterion of simplicity, closeness to observation, and I think that's not I think that's more of a heuristic virtue than some sort of feature of a theory that would matter for its intrinsic probability, right? I do think there is a fairly good mapping from leaving few unanswered questions to the kinds of issues that advocates of simplicity talk about, and so it may be that really where that debate will go down is just is this a explanatory feature, right? If not, is it some extra feature of simplicity? Swinburne thinks, for example, that the function f of x equals x, right, is simpler than the function f of x equals x squared, right? And I mean, I don't see that.
Yeah. So I was thinking, if there's a possible case, it might boil down to details of a case where there's brute limits tie, and the tie is broken by simplicity. And if there's cases where there's a simplicity tie that's broken by brute limits, would that imply that neither way of determining the prior probability is superior to the other?
Yeah, I mean, I really just have to look at the details,
See the
the case,
cases, yeah.
see how that
So-
works out. Hard to answer, in the abstract.
In the abstract. So
Yeah.
in the paper, though, you talk about three big theories, three grand explanatory theories. So it's theism, naturalism or atheism, and axiarchism. So what are these theories, and how are we going to compare them?
Well, I did ask before about a third option apart from naturalism and theism. Although, like, do they really want to say that Islam and Christianity are basically like the same grand explanatory theory, just with sort of minor differences? I mean, I don't think that's true. I think that your theology is doing almost all of the work in terms of how God actually accounts for things. But anyway, like, I don't know what this third option is, so let's hear about that.
Yeah. So, like I said at the beginning, like one of the objections to theism is that it's just completely implausible, right? And I think, okay, well, if we're thinking about, assessing prior.
I need to respond to that because I also think that it's not really shifting the burden of proof so much. It's more like a Mott and Bailey tactics, right? So the Bailey is where this goes to like medieval castles, right? The Bailey is like the lowlands where all your workshops and maybe you keep your animals and stables and, where the interesting stuff happens, like where you can be productive and do your activities. And the Mott is the big hill where your keep sits, and that's where you run to when you need to seek defense, because that's more defensible, but it's not like you don't really want to be there. You want to be in the Bailey. So what you do when you're trying to argue for Christianity is you argue about theism. Why? Because it's far more abstract than Christianity. You don't have to defend many of the implausible doctrinal claims, scriptural claims, historical claims of Christianity. You can just hand wave all those away or not worry about them or say, I'm just talking about theism here. Craig does this a lot in his debates, by the way. And so it's just a lot easier. And there's a lot of very abstract philosophical arguments that you can give, such as the ontological argument, that avoid really any specifics at all. But there's like almost no generic theists around. I mean, I suppose there's a few that you meet now and then, but there's hardly any of them. And certainly none of these guys are generic theists. So why are we even talking about theism? Why not talk about what they actually believe? And this is not like subsidiary issues. This is like core things about their worldview. Let's talk about actual hypothesis, because there's no generic theology. It's like, well, why did God create the world? Well, you need a theology. Like, well, why did God give us free will, or did he even give us free will? Like, well, it depends on your theology. What's the answer for evil? Well, it depends on your theology, theodicy in that case. I mean, and Chad even mentioned before about like miracle and resurrection type arguments. So that also directs you to a specific brand of theism, not just generic theism. So the point I'm making here is, why are we talking about theism as a grand explanatory theory? Because I don't think it is. I think it's just a class of theories, and we should identify specific theories within that, like, say, a particular version, like Catholicism might be one that has a moderately well-defined theology, or Calvinism could be another one, or I don't know, Craigian Christianity. I don't know what you might call that. I suppose it's broadly what's the Molinism sort of approach. But the point is that I don't think it's very good to compare naturalism with theism, because I suppose technically speaking, naturalism can encompass a broad class of theories, but most actual naturalists are not going to defend an abstract naturalism. They're going to defend a naturalism which is the real naturalism that they typically believe. And by that, I mean like the naturalism based on actual scientific theories. Because you could also imagine an abstract naturalism which says that, everything's like material or something like that, but doesn't actually wed itself to any scientific findings, like at any level of detail. And I mean, I suppose there are sort of philosophers who approach it that way, but I mean, mostly when people are naturalists, they're going to appeal to scientific findings, at least to some extent, to undergird their naturalism. And that's going to be the same for theists as well. They're going to appeal to their particular theological beliefs. So the point I'm making there is, let's actually put the relevant contenders on the table and give them the labels that they should have and bring in the specificity. I think theism is just boring for this reason, because there's just no theists around. There's only particular, there's no general theists around. There's just particular theists. And that's where a lot of the meat comes from. I think the discourse would just be a lot better if we focus at that level.
Probabilities on the basis of, how many unanswered questions does theory have? We can get rid of a lot of crazy theories, a lot of theories that people have held.
Hang on, what did he say?
So what are these theories, and how are we going to compare them?
Yeah, so like I said at the beginning, like one of the objections to theism is that it's just completely implausible, right? And I think, okay, well, if we're thinking about assessing prior probabilities on the basis of, how many unanswered questions does theory have, we can get rid of a lot of crazy theories, a lot of theories that people have held, over the years using that criteria. And so what I end up arguing for the paper is that there are three grand explanatory theories that you're going to give.
Sorry, I keep missing what the criteria is.
Yeah, so
But this
you know,
isn't
like I
a
said,
joke.
I mean, like
I'm not getting it.
one of the objections to theism is that it's just completely implausible, right? And I think, okay, well, if we're thinking about, assessing prior probabilities on the basis of, how many unanswered questions does theory have, we can get rid of a lot of crazy theories.
Oh, it's a number of unanswered questions. Just a couple of words I just kept missing. The number of unanswered questions a theory has. That seems like a terrible criteria, right? It's not how many unanswered questions. It's what? But theism doesn't answer any questions about God. Like, again, when I mean generic theism. It's only particular theisms that allow us to say anything about that. Like, generic theism has no answers for, like, what is God like? Why did he create the universe? Why did he give us free will? I mean, if he did or if he didn't, why didn't he? Why does he allow evil? What is his nature? What else did he create, if anything? Like, literally any question you can ask, it doesn't have any answer to this. What is his relation to abstract objects? Is another one. I don't get it. Like, naturalism also, taken as generically, doesn't have an answer to basically any question other than, like, what types of things exist. Naturalism is going to say that gods and spirits and so on don't exist, but doesn't really answer any other question. I don't get this criteria at all. Like, the number of unanswered questions is a function of how generic or how specific a theory is. The more specific it is, probably the more things it answers, the more things I pack into it, right? But you don't need to pack all those things into it to count as, like, theism or naturalism. Because you could be a naturalist and think different things about morality, different things about free will, different things about philosophy of mind, different things about abstract objects, and still be in the naturalism camp. And likewise, theism, you can be lots of different types of theists and answer questions differently. So I don't understand this criteria at all. Like, every worldview is going to leave different things unexplained depending on how much you specify. That in itself doesn't mean it's implausible. It's the more things that postulate. Here's how I think about it. You want fewer postulates, but you want maximum explanatory power, which is things you can account for. So minimum postulates with maximal explanatory power. So you're looking for a trade-off, a sweet spot between those two. And I think that's broadly how we approach scientific theories. Maximal explanatory power with minimal postulates. And obviously there's more to be said about how you assess those things. But just saying how many things are left unexplained, I don't think makes any sense, because you can explain everything just by postulating ad hoc reasons for why they all happen. And then your theory is going to be really complicated, but it's not going to leave anything unexplained. In fact, you could, like, the maximal theory would just be take every every appearance or every like event that's happened in the history of the universe, or at least all of them we know about, and just assert all of them as brute facts. That is, as unexplained things that just happened, or as necessary for that matter. That would be another approach. And that would leave nothing unexplained. It would explain absolutely everything. Well, at least it would explain absolutely everything. Maybe it wouldn't be a good explanation, but that would be the content of the theory, right? That it would just stipulate all of these things as primitives. The problem is that theory is extremely ad hoc. It doesn't unify anything or sort of give an account for why they are all the case. It just stipulates them. That's why it would be a bad theory. But it would pass his criterion because it leaves nothing unexplained. So I don't get the criteria at all. It makes no sense.
A lot of theories that people have held, over the years using that criteria. And so what I end up arguing for the paper is that—
Can you send me the link to that, Nathan?
Grand explanatory theories that you're going to give equal probability. Theism, it's the hypothesis that there is one being of pure limitless intentional power, right? So intentional power is the one property held without a limit. There's naturalism. Naturalism, as I interpreted in the paper, in its most plausible version, is committed to something like a principle of plenitude, where every contingent possibility is realized in some world or other. So this form of naturalism would be, committed to something like an infinite, multiverse. And then
what? Who defines naturalism that way? I mean, sure, there are naturalists who think that. The principle of plenitude, every contingent possibility is realized. I mean, you might think that as a naturalist, but that doesn't even tell you whether you're a naturalist or not. I mean, does that even rule out? I don't think that rules out theism. You could be a theist and think that. Or you could be other types of non-naturalist. You could believe in karma, or you could believe in ghosts or whatever else. And that's certainly not how naturalists typically define naturalism. They usually define it in terms of, science-friendly, believing in the entities of science, not believing in things like spirits and ghosts and magic and stuff. Granted, that's not a very precise definition, although I don't think that being of infinite, limitless intentionality, something like that. I don't think that's precise either. It's just kind of waffle, in my opinion. But his definition of naturalism is bizarre, and I wouldn't subscribe to that brand of naturalism. So, but hang on, there's three options, so maybe I fit into the third option.
Axiarchism, which is committed to something like an infinite, multiverse, and then axiarchism, which is defended by Derek Parfit in a paper, and its basic idea is that reality is fundamentally normative, right? There's a principle of goodness, right? And things exist because they are good. I find in the paper I talk that this.
I don't know enough about Parfit to say whether that's a fair description of his beliefs. I believe that he's a what's the word I'm looking for? Ethical non-naturalist, which I think means that he is committed to some sort of primitive normativity or something. But I don't know if that's how he would describe it. Like things exist because they are good. That sounds pretty bizarre, but I don't have the expertise to comment. But I would say that I don't fit into any of these categories. So I guess my views are just totally implausible and can't be defended at all. But I would add that I think most philosophers wouldn't fit into either of these three categories. Like most philosophers are demonstrably not theists. We have survey evidence of that. I'm pretty darn sure that most philosophers do not think that every contingent fact pertains, like in some multiverse. That's granted my subjective view, but I'll defend that. As for the last view, again, I don't think you're going to get too many philosophers who are going to agree that things exist because they are good. That sounds like a pretty big claim. So like, what the hell's going on? Like these are just bizarre views that, I mean, I'm not saying you can't defend them. It's just, these are the only three that are worth talking about. Like, seriously? I haven't read the paper. So, but I mean, he's summarizing it here. So it should at least, I should at least be able to get the idea of what he's saying.
Fits with certain forms of like impersonal Hinduism that talks of the Brahman as like a creative force. But all of those views have the feature that I think they leave few unanswered questions relative to, what is some of the other views would be. So for example, single universe atheism or single universe naturalism, right, posits a single existing eternal universe, but it doesn't, right, this universe.
Why does it? Why does it have to be eternal? Single universe naturalism doesn't have to posit an eternal universe. It can posit there's so many options there. It could be finite with no cause. It could have a cause that's just not God. Why? This is just, I mean,
has really unique properties, and it doesn't explain, where those properties came from, right? So I think, well, that's a weakness of the view.
So I was actually
unmuted. How does God explain anything? If God just has infinite powers, what has he said? Infinite intentional something. I forget the exact phrase that he used, but something like that. How does that explain anything? Like, ask any question you can think about reality. Laws of nature, moral properties, abstract objects, existence of the universe, historical facts. How does God explain any of those things? Every time I push an apologist on this, they're unable to answer the question. I pushed Luke Barnes on this question. He basically said, read Swinburne. I mean, I'm summarizing it, but he didn't have a lot to say. I pushed IP on this, inspired philosophy, and he said he doesn't see what the problem is, that God doesn't actually explain why this and not that. I pushed the Russian guy, I'm afraid I don't remember his name, that I just debated with recently, and he didn't really say much of it. He, in fact, endorsed the idea that God could have created kind of pretty much whatever he wanted, and therefore I don't think answered the question. So those are just three people that I've interacted with directly, which is why I mentioned them. But the point is, theists I don't think that they can do this. They cannot say why God does this and not that. Why? Because God can do anything logically possible consistent with his nature, right? But that is such a huge swath of things that there's no reason they can appeal to, because that explains why this and not that, because they've ruled everything out. It can't be something outside of God, because then that's constraining God, and that doesn't work. But then if it's something intrinsic to God's nature, then God doesn't have free will, and everything just follows is equally necessary. And you basically get necessitarianism. So everything becomes, and Graham Oppy's made this point, everything becomes just a brute contingent fact, or at least all of God's creative acts or miracle acts or whatever else become brute contingencies, because it's just like, well, God could have done otherwise, but he did it this particular way for no reason, or at least like no reason that we know or we can assert. So they leave everything unexplained from my point of view. God's existence, okay, maybe that's necessary, but like all of God's free choices, they leave unexplained as brute contingencies. How does he avoid that problem? How does Ted avoid that problem? Maybe there's ways around it. I'm not saying there aren't. Unlike him, I'm not just stipulating a bunch of ridiculous things about a different worldview, like his stupid points about naturalism. But so I'm not saying he can't give an account. I'm just saying I've not heard them, and I think that this is a real problem. How is it that theism accounts for these things? You can't just say that it does. You got to give an account. Like, how does it account for these things?
Surprised that you brought up axiarchism, not because of its explanatory virtues, because it is a very explanatorily virtuous view, because if it's true, literally nothing goes unexplained. John Leslie is probably one of the biggest proponents of the view, and he says, if we explain everything that exists because there's a fundamental being that gave rise to it, what explains the fundamental being is that it exists because it ought to exist. And so literally nothing goes unexplained on this view, which is very attractive. But even though it is gaining in popularity, it seems to suffer from a pretty devastating objection. The main principle that, well, X exists because it ought to exist seems circular, since something has the property.
Isn't that kind of true of God, though? Like, God exists because it's in his nature to exist. But if goodness has in its nature that if something's good, it is in the nature of that thing to exist, then that's just basically the same argument applied to things that are not God. Like, I don't really see the issue here. I mean, I think it's an implausible principle, right? But I don't see how it's less plausible than basically the standard argument that theists give about why God exists. Well, God exists because it's in his nature to exist. Well, if your position is just that anything that is good has in its nature, or part of its nature is to exist, then how is that not just a symmetry with what the theists are saying? I don't see the issue here.
Property of oughting to exist only after it exists, so to speak. So it's like its deontic status is logically posterior to its existence. So it's a
okay. First of all, there's no such thing as logically posterior, at least not as far as I'm concerned. But more importantly, couldn't you run the same argument with respect to God? Like, you could say, well, God's only good after he exists. So, or like God's nature only makes him exist after he already exists. So why does he exist in the first place? Like, you could just run the same argument. I don't think that theists are going to accept that. But then why should whoever it is that defend this view accept the criticism that they're giving? It's the same criticism.
Bootstrapping type worry where the thing gets pulled up into existence by this property that it can have only after existing. So if we can eliminate axiarchism because if it's viciously circular, if it does have this bootstrapping problem, then its prior probability is 0. So now we're just thinking about theism and naturalism.
Yeah.
Wait. Something doesn't get a prior probability of 0 just because justifications for it are circular. Like, I may have no good reason for thinking something, but that doesn't mean that its prior is 0. I mean, it might be low, right? But we might just not have the ability to look. Is the number of particles in the observable universe even or odd? You could say, well, we have no way of knowing either way, so the probability of both is 0. But no, that's not right. The prior probability presumably is 0.5 either way. Well, I suppose you might give symmetry arguments for why it has to be even, but there's breakages of symmetry. Let's put that to the side. You get the point I'm making, right? That just because we can't know, or like our arguments are indeterminate, that doesn't mean that the prior goes to 0. And they seem to be saying that there's a bootstrapping objection with respect to giving a justification for the principle of why they exist. But that doesn't undermine the worldview. At most, it's an undercutting defeater for reasons to accept the worldview, not for the view itself. I mean, I don't really trust anything they say about this view. I've never really heard about it and don't know too many people who defend this. Wow, the Wikipedia article for axiarchism is literally 1 sentence long. Excuse me, it's 2 sentences long. The word was coined by Canadian philosopher John Leslie. When did he write about this? I think I've heard of Leslie Bill. Pantheism, interesting. I just don't know how standard this is in the literature. Like, I'm not saying people don't defend this, but they're saying that this is like the third main view alongside naturalism, where they define naturalism in a bizarre way that I don't hold to and I don't think most naturalists do. And then theism is the other one. And yeah, I don't understand what their simple debunking argument for axiarchism was. I'm presuming they probably got one for naturalism as well, so I suppose we should wait for that.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, you can go, whichever way you want to go on these things. I mean, I think in the case, in the overall cumulative case, it's really not going to matter. So once you actually look at the evidence, right, as long as you start off with, the theism having, a modest probability, non-infinitesimally, small, then the evidence is going to matter, right? And I mean, that's the overall strategy in the paper. So,
Yeah.
so I'm very, open to, very friendly to say, I mean, this is a framework, right? And as long as you agree to, the general, the substantive, conclusions that I'm drawing for this framework, there's a lot of leeway on different options, and you're all going to end up in the same spot.
So
Right.
theism.
Chad, do you mind if we move to the Q&A? I want to make sure that we get through as many of these as possible.
Can I ask this one last question? And I was going to say let's get to some questions, some other questions. I was going to just say that theism is a broad camp, and that
Yes, good point.
We got to consider the vast difference between even something like a Unitarian theism that sees God as one person, and Trinitarian theism, which sees God as 3 persons. So my question is, how would the doctrine of the Trinity play in here? I know it's hard. I mean, would Trinity constitute a brute limit on your view, a brute finite limit? Why 3 persons? Isn't 1 better, or why not an infinite number of persons? So does Islam beat Christianity in the intrinsic probability battle here?
Which, of course, Muslims say.
So Swinburne actually has a argument where he thinks that a being of pure limitless intentional power implies that there are going to be 3 persons, right? So a being of pure limitless intentional power is going to be a being of pure love, right? Love gives of itself. Loves to be fully manifest requires co-equals, and he argues that this requires the existence of another person, and perfect love is realized when two people share their love to bring about a third person, like a mini family, right? And so he argues that on philosophical considerations, alone, that being a pure, limitless, intentional power implies the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, that's his argument. I mean, I don't know what I think about that argument.
What do you mean you don't know whether you think? What do you think about that argument? Are you not able to assess that argument for yourself? Any rational person should be able to see how utterly absurd that argument is about all of the things that have just been assumed about how love has to work, like metaphysically has to work, and that gets you this number of 3, like not even 2, like, oh, you have to love someone else. Like somehow there's got to be a third, but then not a fourth. Like it doesn't. When you say, well, the third thing has to love something other than its parents, right? Because then, you know, that it's got to be something outside of that. Like you could just make anything up. This is the point. You can just make it up to get whatever conclusion you want. If you can just make up principles, you can get wherever you want. I could get an argument for 4, 5, 6, 7. Like if Christians want me to do this, I'll make up arguments for why we need the Trinity. Well, it would be Trinity, but why we need God to have those exact numbers. I'm sure I can come up with something. You just have to be a bit creative. You can make things up. That's what this is. And that's, by the way, what a lot of these 154 arguments are. Just made up considerations as far as I'm concerned. Like, oh, here's a thing. Let's turn it into an argument for the existence of God. Not all of them, but a lot of them, I think, are just like that, because there's people have these PhDs in theology or apologetics or whatever, and they've got to earn a keep somehow, employed by a university or a seminary or whatever it is. So you've got to publish in these journals, and well, you've got to do something new. So you've got to crank out another hackneyed version of the same argument, or some other consideration that you've thrown in, like an anthropological argument or a consensus gentium argument or a modal this argument or a prima facie that argument. So it's just making things up most of the time. It's just the opposite of loving wisdom. Like philosophy is supposed to be loving wisdom, and then you get that argument, and then it's like, what are we doing?
In the future, I think it'd be fun to work more on that specific issue. But yeah, no, that's an issue. I mean,
I've got something to say about that.
Okay.
Well, so I follow Josh Rasmussen. He and I are friends, and we talk all the time. This is something that's come up in the argument for the Kalam that I've given in my debate with Rationality Rules. He's an atheist on YouTube. One of the arguments that I gave in that debate was the argument from limits. And so he didn't bring this objection up, but it's come up in from other people. It's like, on the Christian conception of God, you've got this Trinity, but that seems like an arbitrary limit, 3 persons. Like, what explains that? So Josh's response to that is that not necessarily, because I think Swinburne is making a sort of stronger claim that just the concept of God entails or implies or makes probable that there would be these 3 persons, or that the Trinity would follow. But I don't think that's necessary. I think you could just hold that though that property, being the Trinity, has some kind of explanation, has a deeper explanation. So it's not a fundamental property in the sense of being like an unexplained property. So it could just be that any perfect being is going to have, be at least the Trinity or something like that. So it's not that it makes it probable, but it's that it explains why it's the case. So I think that could be.
Does anyone understand what he was saying there? Cameron just seemed to be saying we don't have an explanation for why God is a Trinity, but it might be the case that it's necessary that any perfect being is a Trinity. I mean, okay, sure, but so what? That's just saying maybe there's a reason. Like, well, that's an unaccounted for fact. That's something that's unaccounted for on your theory. If we're going to say we don't have a reason, but maybe there is one, can't I just say that about anything? How is that?
One option, one way that someone could go.
Yeah, not to self-promote, but this is exactly the topic I wrote on for my dissertation, where I argued that the only way to have a self-explanatory being is if it has 3 parts, which of course dovetails nicely into a doctrine of the Trinity. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's get through some questions. We've had a.
How do people not see that? Like, look, I don't mind people arguing for their worldviews. I think that's good, like trying to defend your worldview in the best way possible. So it's not that people have a conclusion and try to defend that. I don't mind that, but it's like, at some point you have to wonder, is this entirely just being creative and making things up? Like, what I think philosophy is good for doing is trying to sort of bridge theories to explain tricky phenomena. Like by tricky phenomena, I mean something like morality, causation, space and time, creation, number, things like this, right? They're things that are kind of hard. We don't quite know how they work. We want to know how they work. So we develop theories to try to explain them. Like, that's what philosophy is kind of good at doing, I think. Well, I mean, it's difficult, but I think that there's a lot of value to be had there, and we just need to get better at doing that. So that's good. And it's fine there to take a starting point from, well, look, broadly, I have this idea about how I think that works, and then I'm going to try to fill in a theory to make that concrete, and then get people to criticize that and see if we can see how good it is, and then maybe I'll change my mind on the basis of their criticisms, and we build up the theory. That's all good. But I just don't feel like, maybe this is my bias here, but like, is that what's being done when we just come up with these arguments for why any necessary being has to be a trinity. It's like, that seems so specific and so putting the cart before the horse that, I don't know. I suppose if you really just firmly believe that, then you might want to think, well, why is God a trinity? And then you'll try to come up with a theory. So I guess that kind of makes sense, but maybe it's just to outsiders. It looks really, really bizarre. I mean, I guess it does also hinge on how plausible the theory is. And from what I've heard, like, I granted I haven't read the papers, but it just sounds like a complete joke. So I don't know. It's just, when you look at things like that, you just have to ask, like, what is being done here? Is this a good faith effort to try to explain something, to try to put forth an explanatory theory, or is this showing up something that we're just committed to regardless of anything? I guess it's a bit hard. Maybe there's yeah, it's sort of individual case by case judgment there. But I can't help but hear those arguments and not think it's completely absurd. Anyway,
a bunch of comments, so let's get to as many as we can. So first of all, this is just a really nice comment from Brute Facts Podcast. He says, fantastic conversation, great matchup, Cameron. So that's cool. I'm really glad you guys are enjoying this. And also thanks for sending in a super chat. So earlier on in the stream, John Van Divier, sorry, I'm probably butchering your name. You sent in another question. I've got it pulled up here. I'll ask it after this one. He says, does having 100+ arguments matter? Is crying out for the response no, because we need to count arguments contra as well. So he asked this earlier in the stream before we talked about, we basically had on the screen 4 different strong arguments, and then
you have to be even-handed. One way to think about the likelihood framework is just think, okay, well, what's the total number of arguments, right? If they're relatively, equal in terms of, one points up this direction and the other point down that direction, both to the same magnitude, right? Then you can play them off against each other, right? And then the question is, okay, well, at the end of the day, what are you left with? You can just count all there. Say, we've got 100 over here, we've got 100 over there, we've got, and then just say, okay, well, that's in effect 0, right? Or we've got 100 over here, we've got 50 over here, so cumulative effect is 50.
And that's why it's also important to establish independence.
Yes.
Right. Because
very good point, Cameron.
I'll read that one more time, because so if you've got, a lot of philosophers have argued that the problem of divine hiddenness, for example, is just an iteration of the problem of evil. So if you basically what you'd be doing in that case is you wouldn't have 2 arguments. You'd have one argument that would maybe be a little bit stronger because you're adding these 2 together. So the likelihood ratio, once you actually factor in these 2 types of evidence, which are
another point about philosophy, apart from trying to make sure that you're engaging in a good faith endeavor to actually explain something instead of just post hoc rationalizing what you already believe. And granted, there may be some fuzziness there, but I do think there's a difference. But another thing, is to use consistent standards to evaluate different arguments or in different areas. And I pointed out some examples before. I'm really struggling to get through this, but we're nearly there, so I'll try to get through. We might skip some of the questions, but with respect to Cameron, I'm just sorry if I'm not being as articulate, because I'm really like, this is so bad. There's a lot of it's just really bad. But what Cameron has done here, he said, oh, look, actually, people have argued that divine hiddenness and evil are kind of like the same thing. And I'm sure that there are commonalities in those two issues, right? So I'm sure there's some argument that you can give that they're not entirely independent. Okay, sure. But let's think about it this way. How many attributes of God are independent of one another? Well, if you believe in divine simplicity, the answer is none. They're all the same as God's nature. So literally no arguments about God in any way will be independent of each other, because they're actually all, with respect to they have the same reference, like they all relate to exactly the same thing. Now, I don't know that Cameron believes in divine simplicity, but even if you don't go that far, like if you think that being a trinity is the only logically possible way or the only metaphysically possible way a perfect being can be, then any argument about the Trinity is is directly related, is not at all independent from any argument about the existence of God. Like, so if that were true, ontological arguments and Trinitarian arguments are dependent on each other now, because one logically derives from another. And if you think that there's a reason why God creates, that maybe it's part of his nature, then arguments about creation are now dependent on and are directly related to, not independent of, any ontological arguments and any Trinitarian arguments. You see the issue here, that the more you sort of close the gap or integrate different aspects of God or decisions or acts of God, then the less separate, the more dependent upon each other those arguments become. On the other hand, if you separate them and you say, look, these are all very different issues, God has many different attributes and he does many different things, and so we can't, then they're independent of each other because he could have one and not the other, then what you've got is a very ad hoc description of God, because there's many things that he could have but could not have. Like maybe he could create, but he wouldn't fine tune, or maybe he'd fine tune without making a world, or without creating sentient beings, or he could create without having without an atonement, or with an atonement. Like, you put all of these things separate from each other so that the argument's now independent, but the problem is that your theory becomes more and more ad hoc, because you're just throwing in all these extra attributes that God has, and there's no underlying reason for it. So there's an underlying problem here, that the more independent of each other arguments for theism get, the more ad hoc all of these different properties and acts and decisions that God is supposed to have or take become. And then theists usually want to move away from that, like Swinburne and Plantinga try to do this by building more into their theology. But then the arguments become more tied up and they're not independent from each other anymore. The issue here is that Cameron just doesn't seem interested or hasn't thought about that. He's only applying it to the naturalism case. He's not applying consistent standards and thinking about, look, what makes arguments independent of each other? I still don't think that's well defined because we still don't have we don't really know what we're talking about with probabilities, and we haven't sorted out a probability space. So that critique I made before still applies. But even that aside, we need a consistent standard for what, in virtue of what, are arguments independent of each other. And a lot of the things that they've been saying so far in the stream would indicate to me that almost none of the arguments of theism are independent of each other, because they all appeal to attributes of God that are very closely related to each other. And so they're not independent. And you can't just apply that to the naturalism case. You need to apply consistent standards.
Sure, not independent. They're together, but once you factor those in together, your likelihood ratio would just go up a little bit. So, or however much you think it does. So that's important though, because when we're talking about, how many arguments there are. I know that, Ted, I know you didn't go and look through all of the different arguments that we did in our stream, but maybe Chad, you can help him out with. Let's talk about the independence of these different arguments that we discussed in this longer stream, and how many do you think realistically? How many independent arguments for theism?
Very good question.
There are versus how many arguments realistically there are for naturalism?
Yeah, I mean, does having 100+ arguments matter? Like Ted said, it might matter. It might not. It depends on how many arguments there are on the other side, and it depends on the weight of those arguments, the weight of the arguments on both sides.
Can you believe we're an hour and 8 minutes in, and he just said that that shouldn't be what you say minute 2, and then you unpack that. Like, this is what I mean. It's going entirely backwards. You say, okay, here's the framework we're going to take. We're going to define our terms as clearly as we can in the time we have, like what counts as evidence for something, how you evaluate your likelihoods, what we mean by probability here. None of these things were done. And then you say, look, what broad classes of what we might call independent arguments are there on both sides? Try to have a fair way to categorize them out. Explain your methodology there. Like, instead we got, there's 7 traditional and 7 non-traditional. No explanation as to why that's the case. And then talk about how you might go about working out the likelihood ratios and assessing the balances. And maybe you could talk about simplicity as well and have a principled way of discussing that's applied consistently to both sides. So this is how I would go about this, right? If I was applying this approach, because that involves defining terms as clearly as you reasonably can, applying consistent standards to both sides, and not jumping over and just making assumptions that are going to be critical for the discussion. But they haven't done it that way. They've talked about all of this stuff, making all sorts of assumptions, applying inconsistent standards, as I've discussed, and then we're an hour and 8 minutes in, and now we're being told that, oh yeah, you need to think about how many arguments are on each side and how plausible they are. Yeah, okay, thanks.
That's important. I'm sorry about cutting you off, but I think that's really important to emphasize, because what we've been assuming, and let me pull it back up on the screen, what we've been assuming over here is that the likelihood ratio is 3.1 for each of these arguments, but that's not necessarily going to be the case. So when you actually do the calculation for so you gave the example, Ted, of the fine-tuning argument. And I mean, I'm of the persuasion that is a very strong argument for theism. So my likelihood ratio for that one would be a whole lot higher than 3.1. And someone, a naturalist or an atheist, someone like Paul Draper, he would think that the problem of evil is a whole lot stronger than 3.1. So I just wanted to emphasize.
Yes,
you just
very good point, Cameron.
Chad, no, I just wanted to kind of show how that works.
I withdraw my criticism of him before. He's really adding to the discussion here, because these two guys didn't mention these critical points here. The fact that different arguments are going to have different weights. Different people are going to assign different likelihood ratios to the same argument. Yes, fundamental points. I mean, these should have been raised an hour before, but I'm glad they're coming up now.
Works is that we're just using these. This is a heuristic. We're just putting these figures in just to give you some idea of how this would look, but that's not necessarily how it's actually going to play out once you get some more definitive numbers.
That's right.
Yeah, but where did the numbers come from? That's the whole point here.
And as far as determining independence, I don't know how to determine independence. There probably isn't a fast and easy way to do that. Determine independence. I mean, how do you determine independence between 150 arguments? I don't know, but I will say this. I mean, this is a topic ripe for philosophical exploration. And if I had the chops, I would do it. But who does have the chops is Tim McGrew. And he tells me that maybe the criteria of independence is overrated. He thinks that there's a way to do a cumulative case style of argument that doesn't even rely on independence. There's a way to do it. The math is more complicated, but there's a way to do a cumulative case style arguments with dependent arguments.
Does Chad not understand the difference between, like, Bayes' theorem works for dependent arguments? It's just that your likelihoods then need to be conditional on all of the other things that it's not independent of. So what I would need to evaluate, for example, instead of just taking the likelihood ratio of the Kalam and the likelihood ratio of resurrection arguments and multiplying them together, what I would need to do is take the likelihood ratio of you can kind of do it either way, but let's say likelihood ratio of the resurrection. I guess it makes sense the other way. Likelihood ratio of the kalam, and then the likelihood ratio of the resurrection conditional on the kalam. And then you can multiply those together, even though they're not independent of each other. So that works. The problem with that is that it's even harder to find out those probabilities, because now it's not just the likelihoods we need to know. It's actually the conditional likelihoods of one argument on another argument. And how on earth do you know that, especially when you have 150 something arguments? That's probably orders of magnitude more difficult. I mean, I say probably because I don't know how much, but it's definitely a lot more difficult, right? So I don't know how Tim McGrew proposes to get around this. I was shaking my head because I have read how he proposes to get around the problem of independence in his paper that he talks about the different witnesses for the resurrection of Jesus. And it's laughable. He just says, well, maybe they're not independent, but if they're not independent, actually the probability is probably going to be even more, like even lower than what I argue it is. Like, it's just laughable. It's the same thing. It's just ad hoc reasoning to get the conclusion you want. I won't get into the details here because maybe we'll do a video on that in the future. But the point is, I see no reason to think that Tim McGrew has any like standards or principles for assessing this. And more to the point, the problem is not actually independence. The problem is finding the likelihood ratios, whether they're dependent on each other or not. Now, if they're not independent, then finding the likelihood ratios is even harder because you need to find the conditional likelihood ratios. But the problem is still the same. And it really seems odd to me that that Chad, I keep forgetting that Chad doesn't seem to understand this. Like, he just sort of says, "Oh, Tim McGrew has a more complicated way of doing it." I mean, yeah, it's just using the conditional probabilities. It's not conceptually that difficult. Mathematically, it can be very difficult because you need to, you have all the numbers to work with.
So that might be something worth bringing on Tim in the future to discuss.
Oh, please don't.
Yeah, that's exactly
what are your
right.
thoughts?
Yeah, that's exactly
right. Well, I'd like to get your
at least Ted. I was going to call him Todd. At least Ted and Chad are not. At least I don't find them too hard to listen to. I mean, Ted seems like a nice enough guy. I find Chad a little bit harder to listen to, just in terms of like tone and so forth. But just Tim McGrew is, I can't stand listening to him. So please don't get him on to talk about this, because I'll feel like I have to review it and then I'll just turn into a puddle of soup or something.
Your thoughts on the question that I asked earlier, which was basically just that, realistically, how many independent arguments do you think there are for theism versus how many independent arguments there are for naturalism? That's ballpark.
Ballpark. I'm working on that issue now, actually. So I'm writing.
Sounds like a simple question.
Yeah, and I'm trying to figure out, how many arguments, right, meet these independence conditions, and honestly, like, I don't want to give a number because I still haven't figured it all out. But,
yeah. Well, we know there are at least two for theism.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I
from consciousness and then from like.
Yeah. I mean, to give it just some examples, like, of the issues I'm working
what was the second one?
If you think about like a Bayesian version of the cosmological argument and a Bayesian version of the fine-tuning argument, right? One of the things that Swinburne does in his approach is, if you go back and look at the values that he's citing, he says, well, look, a perfect being would want to bring about, a world, right, where you can have embodied rational agents, right? And so this increases the probability, right, that a world's.
But now they're no longer independent. Is he going to say that?
Just a simple form of naturalism. But then when you get to the fine-tuning argument, you get the same sort of appeal. Right? You say, well, God's going to want to bring about this.
Yeah, okay.
Right. And that strikes me as, threatening, the independence.
Yes, this is the point I made before. Exactly. The more you try to link them together and make them sound more plausible, the less independent they become. And so they're not, you can't multiply them together as separate. Exactly. I'm glad that that's been acknowledged finally.
Right. That you'd have the existence of the world and it would be fine-tuned. Right. You think, well, look, if the world exists and it's fine-tuned, then clearly the world exists. Right. So it strikes me that those two considerations aren't independent.
Yes.
Right. And so you think, okay, well, just pick one. Right. And the cool thing about, the kind of considerations that, I bring in the book and that Swinburne, brings, is that you don't really lose anything by picking one, because all the considerations that favored, sort of the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, right, are going to carry over, right, to whichever one you pick. Another way to see this is like, the argument.
Well, yes and no. I mean, you can't just multiply the probabilities then, which is the whole point of that silly spreadsheet, right? Instead of having 20 different, like, however many different cosmological arguments plus however many different fine-tuning arguments, you're going to have one, right, which encompasses the best version of all of those because they're not independent of each other. Now, you might say, well, in a sense that you're not losing anything because of the evidence is sort of embodied in that one likelihood ratio, which is fine, but you're not going to get these inflated likelihood ratios from multiplying 3 however many times or 1.5, whatever the number is. So I think that's misleading, saying you're not going to lose anything. It doesn't mean you can just inflate your likelihood ratio. It probably means your likelihood ratio is going to be more plausible because you're not inflating it by multiplying all these numbers together for arguments that aren't actually independent of each other.
from consciousness and the argument from moral awareness.
God,
right? And you might think that those aren't independent for some of the similar reasons.
I just want to say, I mean, I know I have my own, views on things, but I don't scoff at any form of the cosmological or say teleological arguments. Like, I think that there's substance there, but there are a lot of arguments that are just so silly. And like the argument from moral awareness or the argument from consciousness, they're just so silly as arguments for theism, because they don't even have anything to do with God until you jerry-rig them to do so. So I think there are some at least plausible, moderate arguments for the existence of God. I think that they're outweighed by arguments against. But I'm not saying that the evidence all goes one way. I'm not saying everything points against the existence of God. I'm just saying that there are so many things that theists have tried to pull out as arguments for the existence of God that most of them just, I think, are a real stretch and are not arguments at all for the existence of God. And it's just really frustrating to keep hearing these thrown out as if they're like actually good arguments, when I think that they're just a joke.
Right. And so you might think, okay, well, we end up with, maybe, 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments that meet this independence condition, but it turns out that they're all really strong arguments. And then you do the same thing for naturalism, and you think, okay, well, what are the arguments there? And as you mentioned, you might think that evil and hiddenness, right, aren't independent, so they're not two separate arguments. And so I'm kind of thinking at the end of the day, we'll end up with, somewhere around like 5 independent arguments. But in a way, this is also just a framework, So I'm happy for people to disagree and say, no, they're more than that, or those, less than that.
Yeah, that's really good.
Okay. So Ted, you haven't given us a framework. All we've got is Bayes' theorem, which is not a framework. I mean, it's certainly not your framework. It's been around for quite a while now. We've not been importantly, we've not been told how to define these probabilities or what they even mean. We've not been told how to assign likelihood ratios to arguments. Not even any idea about how to do that. And we've gotten very little about how to assign prior probabilities either. You said something vague about like ad hoc stipulations of limits, which I think is extremely implausible and doesn't really tell us much anyway. So we've not got a framework. There's nothing of substance here. That's nothing new other than Bayes' theorem. But the actual all of the important parts of this, the things that I just mentioned, I just swept under the rug or mentioned very briefly. You at least now have to have something to say about how to do that if it's to count as a framework. Otherwise, it's just hot air as far as I'm concerned. There's no framework here.
Okay, so here's a follow-up question that John had. I don't know if it's a follow-up, but it was a good question. Is it possible to show the following claim is unreasonable? Quote, there are no strong arguments for theism. So he wants to know if we can show that that's unreasonable to say that.
Well, sure. I mean, you can define what a strong argument is, right? And you can say a strong argument is one that has a relatively strong likelihood ratio, right? And then you can just, work through particular, cases. And
but how do you know what the likelihood ratio is? And according to whom? If it's subjective, if it's objective, then it's probably going to be even harder to know what the likelihood ratio is.
I think fine-tuning, people realize this is a strong argument for theism.
Some people realize that.
Mean, right, has a significant likelihood ratio of favoring theism over atheism.
Yeah, and I want to point out, Chad, you may even you may be about to say what I'm about to say.
Gray Noppy doesn't think that. So Alex Melpass doesn't think that. To cite two off the top of my head, I think Paul Draper might think that. I'm not sure whether he'd say it's strong, but so
say here is that so you can grant, so if the theist can grant there are strong arguments for atheism, the atheist can grant that there are strong arguments for theism. That doesn't necessarily, and that goes back, I guess, to the distinction that Swinburne makes, is that you can have an argument that raises the probability of some hypothesis, but that doesn't necessarily raise the overall probability of that hypothesis such that it's greater than 0.5. So the atheist can say, okay, yeah, there are some strong arguments for theism, but nevertheless, I still think that the evidence, favors atheism, and the theist can do the same thing. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we're working through these different arguments and trying to weigh them together, is that I know just in me, bias and everything like makes me want to disallow the possibility that there's any evidence against theism. Like, I don't want there to be a really good, strong argument for atheism because I'm a theist. So I feel that pull, but I want to just emphasize that you can allow that. It doesn't necessarily mean or follow that theism is false, or that if you're an atheist, that atheism is false. I think that's important because we want to really try to assess these arguments objectively as opposed to just like going with our gut instinct and following that. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Cameron, these are really good points. Why can't you say these at the start of the video instead of waiting an hour in? I wouldn't have been so mean before. Like, I would have liked to have started with these instead of ended with them.
Yeah, one point I want to make is that I think we can reductio this. Let's do it like this. If there are no strong arguments for theism, then there are no strong arguments for any philosophical position. But there are strong arguments for some philosophical positions. So it's not the case that there are no strong philosophical arguments.
Read the Phil Paper survey. I think there's a new one coming out, but the one from 2009. Theism is the least popular of the arguments that were surveyed, apart from, I think, realism about the external world is the only position, if I'm recalling correctly, that was endorsed more strongly than atheism or agnosticism was. Theism is one of the least credible of the sort of big philosophical issues that are disputed, as evidenced by the Phil paper surveys. I mean, you might there's reasons to be skeptical of that, sure, but the point is you can't run this argument like that. It just isn't true. Like we have evidence that just isn't the case. That arguments of theism are as strong as any arguments for anything in philosophy. No. How do people get away with saying things like this?
For theism. Well, one thing that has impressed me, I mean, just as someone who's spent 20 years now almost looking at philosophy, is there are relatively few strong, indisputably strong arguments in philosophy. And the arguments for theism are about as strong as any argument for a philosophical position could get. Whether you're arguing for the existence of numbers, whether you're arguing for a certain theory of knowledge, whether you're arguing for, it doesn't matter. This is just standard fare as far as standards for good philosophical arguments go. So what I found, though, is that, when we're in the ontology room, when we're doing metaphysics and ontology, talking about whether sets exist, the standards for a good argument are way down here. But all of a sudden, the next classroom in philosophy of religion, the standard for a good argument for God's existence all of a sudden goes way up here. And so I
mean, look, chance of philosopher, I'm not. I just sort of do it as a hobby or as a side interest. But from my readings and exposure, it's not like, I don't know if the philosophers care about deciding whether something is a good or a bad argument. They usually just debate the merits of the argument. They don't usually debate about whether it's a good or like. There's a difference between debating the argument and debating about whether it's appropriate to assign the label good or bad to the argument. Do you see what I'm saying? That they're not the same thing. I don't know that philosophers spend a lot of time worrying about whether it's appropriate to call it like good or bad. They just talk about it. At least that's my experience. Maybe that's different in his experience, I suppose. But I don't. So I mean, I don't know whether what he's saying is true with respect to his particular experiences that he's had in particular classes or whatever. That's his personal experience. But just from the literature, I think that people just make their case and argue for what they want to argue for, and not people will say that's a bad argument, and they'll explain why they disagree with it or what their problems are. But this idea that there's different standards, I don't know. I don't really see that. I don't even know that there's like a standard. It's just like people, in terms of like a threshold, it's like, well, you can't publish this or whatever unless the threshold for the goodness of the argument is more than this level. It's like, is it philosophically interesting, kind of, and does it play by the rules of philosophical discourse? I guess I don't really know what he's saying, and it doesn't resonate with me at all. But I mean, I guess if he's saying in his experience, then it could be in his experience.
I think we need to treat all these arguments fairly and recognize that, look, theism's got arguments just as strong as any argument for any philosophical position.
Amen. All right, here's a question from
That's
Saigar.
just a claim, though. Like I just gave, I mean, Shark put the statistic there, but look it up yourself. Like that's probably better than me even saying it. Look up the Phil paper survey and see what, hopefully the new one will be published soon and we'll be able to look at that. I'll probably do a stream when that's actually published because I think this is interesting, and see how persuaded philosophers are about different philosophical positions. Theism is one of the positions that's least popular of those that were surveyed. Does that mean that there's a different standard for the, I mean, it could be that's because there's a different standard, right? That doesn't disprove it, but it's certainly not evidence in favor of what Chad is saying here. So I'm asking for what is the evidence that philosophers do have a different standard to that? I don't think that there is any evidence, not objective evidence anyway. And so that's just a claim as far as I can tell. Yeah, Chad thinks consensus gentium is a good argument. I ran this in my video about the consensus gentium argument against theism, because most philosophers aren't theists. Not that I think that that's going to persuade anyone, but like, source of the goose and source of the gander sort of thing. Well, I need to go soon, so I need to finish out this video quick.
And Sai is actually speaking at our conference that we have coming up at the end of August. So he's well, I'll just say that you want to come here and speak. He's awesome. Okay, here's this question. From my own experience, I always thought that the probability that God exists, if it's greater than 0, that's sufficient to warrant belief or to allow for acceptance of personal experiences as additional evidence. What are your thoughts?
Well, greater than 0 allows for a lot of room. That's less than a half, and so I would just be concerned that suppose you think the probability that God exists is 0.1, right? Then you think that the probability that there's no God, right, is 0.9, right? So you think it's much more probable, right, that there's
that assumes that you can't like withhold credences, which, I mean, there's a whole other question about that, but anyway,
no God, then that there's a God, and in that condition, it can be difficult to see how that's how you would be accurately described as saying I believe, right, that there's a God, because if someone were to ask you, well, do you think there's a God? You think no. I think more likely than not, there's no God. Now, it can be like, if you're thinking about it in the framework of inquiry, right? Suppose you start off thinking that, there might be a madman in the building, right? So probability of, say, something less than, greater than 0, that there's a madman in the building. In that case, it makes sense to go investigate, right, and gather more evidence to make sure that you're going to be okay, right? And so a lot of people have had the thought is that, well, if you're thinking about this along, along the dimension of like growing and develop, if you think that, there might be a God, then, it definitely makes sense to, go inquire, right, and see if you can turn out more evidence.
So I interviewed.
Terribly unsatisfactory answer. For a start, that assumes that more evidence is to be had. What if this is the posterior, the end product that you reach? Let's take the point one example that he gave. After doing lots of, and looking at all the arguments, right? That just may be the best you can get on the basis of everything that you can find. And to be honest, there isn't actually that much. A lot of it's rehashing the same stuff. But at least that's my view. So saying, oh, you should look for more evidence isn't going to be very satisfactory. But another point here is that Ted here seems to be assuming some sort of evidentialism, that the only way that you can be justified in believing something is on the basis of the evidence. And that's not, an unchallengeable position, like everything is philosophy. But it seems to be relevant to this question, right? Because it seems that you could have a credence of point one in theism, but still believe that God exists, as long as you don't assume that your credences have to map to your beliefs, or that your judgments of the evidence of the evidential plausibility of a claim have to directly map to the beliefs that you have. That strikes a lot of people as plausible that it should be the case, and so they just think that it is. But you can deny that, right? It depends somewhat how you think about beliefs. If you think about beliefs as a cognitive state that like motivates action or something like that, then beliefs don't have to be directly mappable to the evidence. Like, for example, you might say, look, I'm trying to think of an example here. So an example that's sometimes given is when a belief is importantly motivating, and you say, look, there's a collapsing building, and the only possible way I can escape is to jump out the window. And objectively, the chance that I'm going to survive this is pretty low. Maybe it's 0.1, right? But if I stay in the building, the chance that I'm going to survive is essentially 0. So my best bet is to jump out the window, even though I'm probably not going to survive. But maybe psychologically, I can't actually jump out the window. Like, I can't motivate myself to do that unless I believe that I'm going to survive. Like that, it's plausible, at least for some people, right? And so in that case, you can maybe you could say that it's rational, in at least a broad sense, to believe that you're going to survive, even if the evidence points to you probably not surviving. I'm not saying that I think that is the case. I'm just positing that as a possible example, that sort of example that's used against evidentialist views that say that the two have to be the same. And I'm actually sympathetic to the idea that they may not have to be the same. I don't have a firm view on that. But all I'm saying here, I think that just assuming that, oh, well, if your credence is 0.1, then you can't be a theist, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. It's not high enough. I think that's too fast and loose. That's too quick. And it's useful to actually think about other ways of talking about belief. So I think there's a conversation to be had here. And I'd actually be interested to what Nathan would say about this, because I don't know that he claims to have a particularly strong like evidential justification or like credence in the idea that God exists, but he still labels himself as a Christian, right? And I presume also a theist. So that's just a counterexample from my own experience, right? Where it's not clear that this is true either. So yeah, I'm not sure that basically your evidential judgment of the sort of credence that you assign to a proposition needs to be the same as how you would describe your belief in it.
Dr. Liz Jackson on the topic of faith, and this kind of came up, and so I wanted to just give an example that she gave that was really interesting to think about. And I don't really have any settled thoughts on it, but so here's basically the case. So imagine a mother who she's got a son, but the son was in some kind of accident. Maybe they were. I
think he's actually going to give a similar account.
So you don't know the state of the son, if like he's still alive or what. So, but nevertheless, the evidence that the building collapsed, she hasn't heard from him. That may lower the probability.
So I'm just going to skip because I need to actually leave soon. But I think Cameron was making a similar point.
If so, why?
Oh yeah, I mentioned this before.
Yeah, so I do argue for that in the paper, and I maybe point you to that discussion. So the argument basically is that if we use explanatory reasoning to determine what are the plausible grand theories, we end up with a limited number of grand theories of the universe. And the paper argued for 3, right? And then argue that since in this case,
but it's actually only 2
from prior probabilities to give one more probability than the other, then we should.
Can you just imagine just Buddhism, which doesn't seem to fit under either of the categories that he's mentioned? Just well, I don't know if that fits under axiarchic or whatever, but he also rejected that. So I don't think Buddhism would fit into that category. But anyway, they just seem to be a whole bunch of views that it just accorded 0 prior probability. I just think this is so silly, but I haven't read the paper, so I guess I should be careful.
Assign them equal probability, right? So that would be an application of a limited form of the principle of indifference. There are objections to the principle of indifference when you don't know
But Ted, people have objected to the principle of indifference, and actually no one's been able to give a successful philosophical account of the principle of indifference that's been widely accepted. Again, like, that's true, right? But I'm being sarcastic about it because I think that Ted's being very inconsistent here. When he wants to help himself to something, he'll help himself to it. When he doesn't like it, he says, oh, it's problematic and we can't give an account of that. That's inconsistent standard. You can do one or the other, but I don't think you can do both just when it's convenient.
Space to distribute probability evenly over those. And so you do get, the conclusion that in this case, theism and naturalism do have the same prior probability.
So then when we had the calculator up, I'll just pull it up one more time. I mean, to me, this seems like a really good place to start, because suppose that, as we were doing earlier, how we started out with 4 arguments here, and then, that updates the numbers. And then we said, well, maybe there's 2 arguments for atheism that we think are strong. So then we just lower this down. So I think that's a really even
Cameron's
way of
got the
doing
control
it,
now.
You keep the probability, the starting probability.
Who gave Cameron control of the spreadsheet? Put your hand up. Who was it? Who was responsible? He can't be trusted with putting these numbers. Last time it was Chad who controlled this, but evidently he's got it now. At least allow us to put in arguments for and against. At least allow us to do that. Come on.
That God exists at 0.5. Then you can just mess with the numbers this way, or you could do it this way. You could say, what are 2 arguments for? So at 0.9, so 1 minus 0.9 would be 0.1. So you could do your starting probability at 0.1, and then say you've got 4 arguments for God, and you.
Oh, I can't take this
argument. Or if you think that it's true that either God exists necessarily or God's existence is impossible, that's gonna screw our probability equations up. Ted, I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that.
No, ontological status and epistemic probability. I mean, this is a fairly basic point. Sorry, I'm having trouble here because some of this stuff seems so basic. Look, either P equals NP or P doesn't equal NP, right? This is a postulate in mathematics. Like, those are the only 2 options. First of all, does a principle indifference argument have to mean that there's a 50-50 chance of both? No, actually, I don't think that follows at all. And I think most mathematicians think that it's probably P does not equal NP. So principle of indifference arguments are really problematic in those sort of cases. But also, does it mean that whichever of those claims is true necessarily? It's a mathematical fact, right? It's either necessarily true or necessarily false. But does that mean that I can't have subjective credences, degrees of belief about which is more likely to be true? Of course it doesn't. They're different things, right? God either exists necessarily or he doesn't under the usual definition. But I can still have different degrees of belief about whether that's likely or not. So this is a fairly standard distinction between epistemic probability and ontological status, or I guess ontological probability is not really a thing, but like necessity and degrees of belief in terms of subjective degrees of probability.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, it's kind of an assumption of this way of approaching, the confirmation of theism, that you're not giving unit probability to either God exists or God doesn't exist.
Well, yeah.
So it's somewhere, between 0.
But you can still entertain necessary existence or non-existence. That's perfectly consistent with this approach. So that's actually not a problem that I think this approach has. It's got plenty of other problems.
Another thing I think is really important to sort of point out, as Cameron was doing, is that the cool thing about this framework is that you think, okay, well, we're being too generous with the probability, the prior probability that God exists. It's like, okay, well, in that case, just lower it.
Yeah. We already did.
Look at how much it goes up with just 10 medium.
Really, why the earn case is important, because you can see. Right,
they're just playing around.
I thought that's what this number was. I was like,
oh my gosh,
and 1 and 2. So, I mean, if we have a likelihood ratio above even 1 and 2, I mean, we're already doing better than most.
Look at this. Look how high it's gone. Look at how high it's gone, everyone, even though they're putting this tiny number. Wow. Isn't that so impressive?
Right. And that's a case where you think,
actually, remember.
Okay, they got
I think I was asking the audience. This is when I was asking the audience for questions or objections to address. Yeah. So I believe
you can think about, okay, so do you think science is plausible? Why is science plausible? Why are scientific theories plausible? And you think, well, because they, have these features. They explain a lot. They don't posit brute limits.
Scientific. I can't deal with this anymore. Science has nothing to do with. Evaluating scientific theories has nothing to do with whether they postulate brute limits. I mean, okay, you can advance that as a theory of judging scientific explanations. I've never seen that. I mean, I've looked a little bit into this. I've not seen that advocated before. Not about judging quality of scientific explanations. And I'd like to see a good argument as to why that's relevant. I mean, scientists don't even talk about limits like that. This is just something that's been made up. I think I have to end it here. There's only a few minutes left. I need to run. So let me summarize. That I was going to try to run it out, but that last one really triggered me. This brute limits nonsense. Okay, let's summarize. Let me turn that off. So what have we learned here? First of all, Cameron hasn't learned his lesson. He's still pushing this spreadsheet, despite having said in a few contexts that he doesn't actually think it's that useful. So that's one thing we've learned. Another thing that we've learned is that despite having an hour and however long, an hour and a half nearly to talk about this, they were unable to give, or at least unwilling to give, an explanation as to what these probabilities even mean. What philosophy of probability are they using? Because these can't be frequentists because they're applying to arguments. That they're not something that like happens a number of times. So presumably it's a Bayesian understanding of subjective probability. But if that's true, then any result that you get is purely going to be relative to the person making the probability assessments and is not therefore useful for assessing the objective evidence, the evidential standard for something. Now, I know there is an objective Bayesian understanding. I don't really know how it would work in this case, but they didn't discuss it. So there's a problem there of not defining what they're even talking about in terms of probabilities, which is, I think, very important here. Then there's the issue of how do you assign the likelihood ratios? What is the method? What are the principles that we use? And we didn't really get anything other than vague talks about how well it accounts for the data, which, I mean, is not even the same as likelihood ratio. That's explanatory power. But I mean, maybe you can say they're related, but there was just very little said about this. And that's the key point. Where do these numbers come from? They were just making them up. They're pulling them out of nowhere, right? Creation ex nihilo indeed, as one could say. And people are going to disagree about these, as Cameron actually pointed out. And so they're useless for actually advancing the argument, because the theist is going to say that the likelihood ratios are high. The atheist or naturalist is going to say that they're low. Well, like we already knew that. Different people are persuaded by different arguments. So the likelihood ratios are not defined. We're given no method for coming up with them, and they were not critiqued sufficiently. The issue of independence was not discussed adequately. It was mentioned a few times. We were given no methods for assessing independence. And the comments that were made about it came too late, and I don't think were satisfactory in terms of addressing the fundamental difficulty this has. Because remember, they said, we don't really know how to assess independence and it's tricky. And then shortly after that, sorry, I bumped my desk, they went on to just sticking a bunch of numbers in the calculator. And I kind of skipped over that because it's hard enough to watch. But you see the inconsistency here. If we can't assess independence, or we don't know how to do that, then you can't just stick numbers in the calculator, because it's just giving you garbage out if you're assuming independence, as that calculator does. So the independence issue was not sufficiently discussed. Related to that, which I'll count as a separate point, the more independent you try to make your arguments for the existence of God, the more ad hoc it becomes to postulate all of these different things or properties that God has. The more you try to combine them together, the less independent they become. So Ted actually did mention that at one point, but that's another fundamental problem. Let's see. So that was 5 things. Also, as the 6th, Ted's point about the fact that there's only like 3 fundamental worldviews, but then axiarchism can just basically be thrown away. So there's actually only 2. And then he defines naturalism in this really bizarre way, where it's like all contingent actualities or all contingent states of affairs are actual or something, which I don't know too many people hold to. And then sits that against theism, even though those are extremely generic. And I think that we should be looking at more specific theories of naturalism and theism. I think that whole approach is misconstrued and not actually helpful, because no one really believes in those views. We had inconsistent standards being applied with respect to, for example, the idea that, oh, well, we can't apply simplicity as a standard because no one has a good theory of that. But then Ted just helped himself to like explanatory power and something about ad hoc limits as judging explanatory power, which wasn't really justified at all. And he helped himself to interpretations of probability like Bayes' theorem, without critiquing that or problematizing that. So no consistency in terms of what is problematized and what's just sort of taken for granted. And I think that's just really, really problematic when you're trying to do good philosophy. And then I'll just add on just some really bizarre claims, like the whole stuff about the Trinity, all that we can give a good explanation of why a necessary entity needs to be a Trinity. Like, seriously? I just find it so hard to take that sort of argument seriously. Or like another example would be the idea that, well, it's all about how many ad hoc limits something has. And if it doesn't have any finite limits, and if it doesn't have any finite limits, then it's like you don't need to explain it for some reason, because a limit is like something that we postulate as a positive thing in our ontology, as opposed to just being the absence of the relevant causal power or property. Like, how is that working? I mean, sure, maybe you can give an account, but it just seems like really bizarre and ad hoc. So I mean, there's probably a few other things that I forgot, but that's a brief summary of some of my problems with this video. I think it's terrible. The alleged framework here for assessing arguments was not actually presented or defended in anything like the detail we would need. We weren't told, importantly, how to assess the likelihood ratios, or how to assess independence, or how to assess simplicity or prior plausibility, the 3 kind of key elements you would need for this to work. So there's no framework here. You can't use this framework. At least they haven't established you can use this framework to assess like at the number of different arguments. And I think, as I said at the start, you just get out what you put in. If you think it's plausible, you'll get a high likelihood ratio. If you think it's implausible, you'll get a low likelihood ratio. And I was really disappointed, although I didn't go in with good expectations. I was still disappointed by the quality of some of the argumentation here. Now, I will say Cameron did actually make a few good points, mostly near the end, in asking some of the questions that I had in mind. I would have liked to have seen those come at the start of the discussion and be the foundation for more they discussed. So that's a positive thing that I will say. I'll repeat my invitation to Chad or Ted or Cameron if they want to come and discuss these. I'd be more than happy to. I will discuss any of those 154 arguments with any of them, or any one of them, or all of them, or the framework itself if they would like to. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you found this interesting. Check back later for more of these videos. See ya.